I had been looking forward to that weekend for months. The city felt heavier than usual in late October, gray and damp, and the constant hum of traffic made me crave silence like air. I wanted a place where I could be alone, where the only sounds were natural and uninterrupted. That's how I ended up renting a cabin deep in the forest, far from the nearest town, far from any road that wasn't gravel and uneven. The description online had promised isolation, privacy, and a kind of untouched wilderness that would make city life feel distant. The reviews were sparse, but glowing. The cabin was old but sturdy, with electricity hooked up to a small generator and water supplied from a well. It was exactly what I needed. No internet, no distractions, just a single room with a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a wood-burning stove. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already leaning toward orange and gray, the forest casting long, dark shadows across the narrow dirt path. My car rattled over roots and stones as I approached the clearing where the cabin sat. When I first saw it, I felt a rush of relief and excitement. The structure was small and simple, built from rough timber that had aged to a deep brown, almost blending with the trees around it. A small porch ran across the front, with a single rocking chair that seemed almost abandoned. The windows were clean but old, the glass slightly wavy. I parked, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the porch. The air was different here, cooler, heavier, smelling of wet leaves, pine, and something earthy I couldn't name. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well kept. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty books and old camping gear. The wood stove sat in the corner, clean and ready, with a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside it. I unpacked slowly, taking the time to place my things exactly where I wanted them, making the space my own. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, low and constant, a sound I found comforting at first. I started a small fire in the stove and sat near it, watching the flames twist and spit. The room glowed with an amber light, soft and steady, and I felt the tension of the city slipping from my shoulders. The first night was quiet. I went to bed early, letting the darkness envelope me as I drifted into a light sleep. The isolation was both peaceful and strange. Even with the comforting warmth of the stove, the forest seemed alive just beyond the windows. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me aware that I was utterly alone. I kept reminding myself that nothing here could hurt me, but a small part of my mind remained alert. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound outside, a faint thud, like a branch breaking under weight. First, I froze, listening carefully. The sound repeated, softer this time, almost deliberate. I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon. The forest was full of them. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sound kept me awake, shifting from one side of the cabin to the other, scraping lightly against the wood siding. I eventually drifted off, tension coiled in my muscles, my dreams shallow and fragmented. The next morning, I noticed something odd. My firewood pile, which I had stacked neatly the day before, was slightly disturbed. A log had rolled a few inches away from the stack. I frowned and examined it carefully. Nothing else seemed missing, nothing else disturbed, but I felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the isolation I had chosen. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a larger creature searching for food. I checked the area outside the cabin, scanning the trees and underbrush. Nothing moved. I returned inside and tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I brought a backpack with water, a first aid kit, and a small hatchet. The path behind the cabin led to a stream, winding through dense trees. The forest floor was thick with leaves, slick in places with mud. As I walked, the sounds of the forest were vivid. Birds called out to each other, squirrels rustled, and the wind shifted constantly. I found myself drawn deeper into the woods than I had expected, following the stream as it curved and narrowed. I noticed subtle signs that someone or something had been there, footprints, not my own, pressed lightly into the soil, partially washed over by rain. I stopped and crouched, examining them, They were small, human-sized, but I couldn't tell if they were fresh. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself again that I was imagining it. Returning to the cabin, I decided to secure everything. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure the firewood was stacked safely, and placed a few heavy stones by the edges of the porch. That night, I slept with the bedroom window closed, the wind louder than usual, making the trees sway with a hollow, groaning sound. Around midnight, I woke again to a noise. This time, it was deliberate, the porch floor creaking under weight. I froze, listening. The sound paused, then shifted slightly, like someone pacing slowly. My stomach turned. I stayed still, straining my ears. After a long minute, the sound stopped. My first instinct was to convince myself it was a falling branch, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I sat up in bed, fully awake now, and realized that the isolation I had wanted was also a vulnerability. I had no one nearby to call for help, no cell service except for a faint signal in the far corner of the cabin. I debated getting dressed, but I didn't want to expose myself. I grabbed the hatchet I had left by the bed and held it tightly, listening. The minutes stretched into an hour. Nothing moved. Eventually, I forced myself to lay back down, tension draining slowly but leaving a lingering sense of alertness that I couldn't shake. The following morning, I took a long walk to clear my mind, carefully observing everything around the cabin. The footprints I had seen yesterday were gone, replaced by newer prints in the damp soil, some leading toward the cabin and some away. I kept to the well-trodden paths, avoiding the thicker brush. Returning, I inspected the cabin more thoroughly. The windows were intact, nothing inside seemed missing, but the firewood pile again showed minor disturbance, logs slightly out of place. I realized I was being watched or visited by someone or something during the night. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture in front of windows, reinforced the doors with the heavier wood I found outside, and ensured the stove was ready to use. I made a plan. Stay awake in short bursts through the night, watch for movement, and if necessary, defend myself. The forest, which had felt peaceful and beautiful in daylight, now seemed alive with unseen presence. Every shadow felt heavier, every sound sharper. The nights became increasingly tense. Each one, I heard the soft creaks and scratches outside. Sometimes, I thought I could see a shadow move past the window. I never saw anyone clearly, but the footprints, the disturbed firewood, the shifting sounds were unmistakable. I documented everything in a notebook, marking time and observations, trying to rationalize and track the activity. I knew fear was playing tricks on me, but instinct screamed caution. On the third night, I heard a different sound, closer this time. Something tried to open the door. The handle rattled lightly at first, then pressed firmly, testing it. My heart hammered in my chest. I held the hatchet, ready, and watched the door. The movement stopped as abruptly as it began. I waited for what felt like hours. Eventually, I crawled quietly to the window and peered outside. Darkness stretched into the forest, trees swaying gently. Nothing. The fourth day, I decided I needed to leave. The forest no longer felt safe, the isolation now a threat. I packed quickly, securing the cabin as best I could. As I loaded my car, I noticed faint footprints leading toward the trees. They were smaller than mine, careful, deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine. I left the cabin quickly, driving the rough path back to the main road without stopping, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Back in the town, I checked into a small motel. The relief of lights, people, and noise was immediate. I slept deeply for the first time in days. In the following weeks, I reported the disturbances to local authorities, who advised me that the area, while remote, had occasional trespassers and that cabins like mine were often targeted by hunters or drifters. They told me that no one had been caught recently, but the patterns fit. I realized then that my fear had been justified and that isolation can be beautiful, but it comes with risks I had underestimated. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile safety can be in the wilderness. I started taking day hikes instead of overnight trips, choosing trails where other people were nearby. The forest still calls to me, but I now approach. I had planned this cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away, a few days to disconnect from work, the city noise, and the constant hum of other people's lives. I found the cabin through a small website, one of those listings that promise complete isolation and a beautiful view of the surrounding forest and lake. The photos looked perfect. A rustic log cabin with a stone chimney, a small dock leading into the water, and a backdrop of pine trees stretching endlessly into the horizon. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I expected. The directions were simple enough, but the roads became narrower, then unpaved, and finally just a dirt track winding up a steep hill. My car bounced over rocks and loose gravel, dust curling in small clouds behind me. The sun was starting to drop when I finally pulled up. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, giving the impression someone had been here recently. But when I stepped out and looked around, it was completely silent except for the wind rustling through the trees and a few distant bird calls. The cabin itself was sturdy, made from thick logs with metal hinges on the doors and old glass windows framed with rough wood. Inside, it smelled of pine and old wood, with the faint trace of smoke lingering in the air. The furnishings were simple. A kitchen table with a couple of chairs, a small wood stove, a couch with worn cushions, and a single bedroom in the back. There were shelves with basic cooking utensils, cans of food, and firewood stacked neatly near the stove. Everything seemed functional, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction at how untouched and organized it was. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring. Outside, the lake looked calm, a mirror reflecting the colors of the evening sky. I walked down the small path to the dock, testing the old wood boards with my weight. They creaked, but they seemed solid. I could see fish moving just below the surface, small ripples disturbing the otherwise perfect reflection of the trees. I stood there for a long time, breathing the crisp air and enjoying the quiet. For the first time in months, it felt like nothing demanded anything from me. As the sun dipped below the treeline, I went back inside and lit the wood stove. I had brought a small pile of firewood, enough for a couple of nights, and the smell of burning pine filled the cabin, warm and comforting. I made a simple dinner, canned soup and bread, and ate while watching the flames dance. Outside, the forest grew darker, shadows creeping along the edges of the clearing. I kept the lights low, wanting to preserve the connection with the outside, the feeling of being in a remote place where nothing else existed. Night fell fully, and the darkness was almost total. I lay in the small bedroom, listening to the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. At first, it was peaceful, almost hypnotic, but then I began to notice other sounds. Faint, subtle noises that didn't belong to the natural world. The soft crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, the barely audible shift of something moving on the perimeter of the clearing. I told myself it was just an animal, deer or raccoon, maybe even the wind moving through loose branches. But the sounds were too deliberate, too close. I sat up, heart hammering, trying to tell myself I was being paranoid. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked. The cabin had thick wooden doors with old metal latches, and none of the windows seemed loose. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks because I was alone in an unfamiliar place. I tried to go back to sleep, but my senses were heightened, every small sound amplified in the quiet of the night. Around midnight, the noises stopped, and I finally drifted off. I woke intermittently, every time convinced I heard something brushing against the cabin walls. By the early morning, I had convinced myself it had all been imagination. The sun was just rising, casting a pale light through the windows. The forest looked calm, the lake still. I forced myself to eat breakfast and drink coffee, convincing myself I would take a hike and burn off the residual anxiety. The day passed uneventfully. I explored the surrounding area, marking a few paths in the forest and taking mental notes of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I found a small stream that fed into the lake, clear and cold, and I followed it for a while, watching as the water twisted and turned around rocks and fallen branches. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, feeling exhausted but satisfied. I stacked more firewood, cleaned up a bit, and prepared another simple meal. That evening, however, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I was sitting on the couch, staring into the fire, when I noticed a faint shadow moving just outside the window. I froze, straining my eyes. The clearing was empty, but the shadows of the trees shifted unnaturally. Then I saw it again, a darker shape, not one of the trees, moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog, but its movement was deliberate, almost human. My stomach dropped. I stayed very still, watching. The shape disappeared behind a cluster of trees, then reappeared a few minutes later, closer to the cabin. My pulse quickened. I considered leaving immediately, but the car was at the top of the hill, and it would be dangerous to run through the forest in the dark. I grabbed a flashlight and a small hatchet I had brought for safety. I told myself I would wait until I could see clearly before taking any action. Hours passed. The shape didn't reappear, but every small sound made me tense. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping, the soft brush of something moving against the undergrowth. I kept the hatchet close, every muscle coiled, listening. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, watching, waiting. The fire burned low, and I fed it sporadically to keep some light in the cabin. Dawn didn't come soon enough. When the sun finally rose, the forest looked normal again, peaceful and silent. I convinced myself to leave immediately. I packed quickly, double-checked the doors, and started the walk to my car. The forest was still, the clearing empty. I reached the car and breathed a small sigh of relief, thinking the worst was over. As I drove down the dirt road, I replayed every detail in my head. The cabin had been safe structurally, well-built, and intact. There were no broken windows or signs of forced entry. Whatever had been out there was gone, and I had no concrete proof it had ever existed. But the experience left a mark on me. I realized how easy it was to feel exposed, vulnerable, in a place where humans were absent, where even a small noise could trigger deep fear. Back in the city, life returned to normal quickly. I shared the experience with a few friends who mostly laughed or shrugged it off. Some said I was imagining things, others suggested wild animals. I didn't know, and I never found out. But I never returned to that cabin, and I never went on a trip to complete isolation again. The lesson stayed with me. The forest is beautiful and peaceful, but it is also indifferent, and being alone there leaves a person at the mercy of every small, uncontrollable element. The cabin itself remained a strange memory, a place where fear was immediate, real, and tangible, but ultimately survived. I left feeling shaken, but also alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I had confronted the unknown, survived it, and returned to normal life with a new respect for the quiet, for the unseen, and for the simple act of being safe among other humans. The fear faded with time, but the clarity remained. Isolation can bring peace, but it also brings awareness of how fragile our sense of control really is. Even years later, when I think about that cabin, I can feel the tension of those nights, the silence punctuated by small noises that seemed enormous in their impact. I remember the smell of pine, the warmth of the fire, the glint of sunlight on the lake. I remember feeling utterly alone and yet aware of being watched by something I couldn't see. And I remember the relief, the deep satisfaction of making it through, leaving the forest behind, and returning to the life I had temporarily escaped. It taught me a lesson about respect, for nature, for isolation, and for the tiny, invisible threats that can make solitude terrifying. And in that respect, it was a trip worth taking, even if I never returned to that cabin again. I had planned the trip for weeks, carefully mapping out every detail, checking weather reports, making lists of supplies, and ensuring that the small cabin I had rented was stocked and ready. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a week away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of work. I had been looking forward to solitude, the kind of solitude that let you feel the world in its raw, natural state without any interruptions. The cabin was somewhere deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by dense pine trees and a narrow river that ran behind it. The area was remote, almost isolated, and that was exactly why I had chosen it. The drive there had been long, but it was peaceful in a way that only long drives through empty country roads can be. I could feel my stress melting away as I left the town behind, passing abandoned barns, fields full of wildflowers, and occasional signs warning of wildlife. By the time I reached the dirt track that led to the cabin, the sun had dipped low in the sky, turning the horizon a deep orange and pink. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing near the cabin and looked up at it. From a distance, it looked inviting, almost quaint. It was small, made of weathered wood, with a slanted roof and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in some time. A narrow trail led from the cabin to the river, winding through thick trees. The first thing I did was unload the car, carrying my bag, supplies, and a cooler full of food and water to the cabin. The air was cool and damp, the smell of pine strong and sweet. I could hear birds settling for the night, and the river behind the cabin gurgled quietly, as if it had its own steady heartbeat. The cabin itself was simple. Inside, it had a small kitchen with a gas stove, a sink, a few cabinets, a dining table, and a small living area with an old couch and a wood-burning stove. There was one bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom with a shower and a toilet. Everything was functional but sparse. I liked that. It felt like a place that demanded respect, like you were an intruder in a world that had existed long before you arrived. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the stove, ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, and then lay on the bed listening to the night. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. Branches snapping under small animals' feet, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of an owl. I slept soundly, the kind of sleep you get when your mind is free of distractions. The second day, I woke early, the light filtering in through the small windows and the smell of damp wood filling the room. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading down to the river, which was shallow in some parts and deeper in others. I walked along the bank, feeling the cold water on my hands, watching fish dart between rocks, and noticing how the forest changed with every step. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. The sounds of civilization were gone, replaced entirely by the rustling of trees and the movement of wildlife. I marked a few places I thought would be good for fishing or sitting to watch the river, and then headed back to the cabin before dusk. That night, after another simple dinner, I settled in for the evening. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed with a quiet, persistent groan. I lay in bed, the fire slowly dying in the stove, and listened. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped sharply, close enough to make me sit up. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox, common enough in the area. I got up and looked out the window, shining my flashlight into the forest, but I saw nothing beyond the shadows of trees. The third day was when things began to feel strange. I woke to find the cabin door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. My heart started pounding as I checked the locks again, but nothing seemed broken. There were no footprints in the dirt nearby, no signs that anyone had been there. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I must have left it unlocked without realizing it. But a part of me felt uneasy. I spent the day outside, trying to distract myself, chopping a small pile of firewood, collecting water from the river, and exploring further into the woods. By the afternoon, I had wandered farther than I intended, following a narrow animal trail that led to a small clearing with a fallen tree. The air was still, almost too still. I noticed that the forest felt different here, oppressive in a way I couldn't quite describe. The shadows were deeper, the wind muted. I didn't stay long. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something else. The food in my cooler was slightly out of place. Not stolen, not obviously tampered with, but moved just enough to make me notice. I double-checked my supplies, counting everything. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was growing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound made me tense, and every shadow looked like movement. I stayed by the window with my flashlight, watching the trees sway in the wind, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The fourth day, I decided to investigate further. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a knife, and followed the trail that led into the woods beyond the clearing. The trees were thick, the ground uneven, and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. I walked for hours, marking the trail with small pieces of bark and string so I could find my way back. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed absent, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. Then I saw it, a set of footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too large and heavy, and they moved off the trail in a direction I hadn't taken. My stomach sank. These were human footprints. Someone had been here, following the cabin, possibly watching. I felt a cold rush of fear, but I forced myself to stay calm. I traced the footprints for a while, but lost them near a rocky incline. The sense of being watched stayed with me the entire way back to the cabin. By the time I returned, it was late afternoon. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the shadows longer and darker. I decided to lock every door and window, securing the place as best I could. I also made a mental note to leave the next morning, to get out of this forest before something happened. But that night brought the worst. I was lying on the bed when I heard the noise, not a small rustle or animal sound, but a deliberate, heavy thump on the roof above the cabin. Then another, like someone was walking slowly and heavily. My heart raced. I grabbed the knife and moved to the window, shining the flashlight into the trees. Nothing moved, but the sound continued. I could hear it on the roof, shifting from one side to another, deliberate, measured. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a large raccoon or a bear, but the rhythm, the weight, and the pauses didn't fit. I couldn't see anything, but the presence of someone or something was undeniable. Hours passed, the noise stopping only intermittently. I stayed awake the entire night, gripping the knife, checking every sound, every shadow. The forest seemed alive, almost breathing, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made my blood run cold. By dawn, I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. I knew I couldn't stay another night. Morning came, gray and misty. I packed my things quickly, taking only essentials. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that froze me. Footprints surrounded the cabin. Not animal tracks, human footprints, large, heavy, and circling the cabin in a deliberate pattern. I hadn't seen them arrive, I hadn't heard them in the daylight, but they were there. Panic surged, but I stayed calm, keeping my voice quiet even to myself. I loaded everything into the car, double-checking the doors and windows before leaving. The drive back was tense. Every shadow along the dirt track, every movement in the trees made me tense, expecting someone to appear. I didn't stop until I reached the first paved road, and even then I felt the unease linger. I reported the incident to the local authorities, giving them a detailed account of the footprints, the noises, and the feeling of being watched. They promised to investigate, but admitted that with the remoteness of the area and the lack of physical evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The experience left a mark on me. I realized that the forest, as beautiful and peaceful as it could be, also had a dangerous, unpredictable side. Solitude in such isolation comes with risks that no planning can entirely mitigate. I went back to the city, but I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints, the sound on the roof, and the oppressive silence of the deeper woods. It changed the way I looked at being alone, at the thin line between peaceful isolation and exposure to danger. Months later, I returned to the same region, but not the same cabin. I took a guided path, a well-traveled area with people around, staying alert but safe. I could still hear the wind in the trees, the river gurgling, but it was different this time. I wasn't alone, and the threat, whatever it had been, was gone. I realized then that fear I never expected that the trip I had been planning for months would turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. But looking back, there were signs, small and almost imperceptible, that I had ignored. I had always considered myself someone who could handle discomfort and isolation. I liked the idea of being alone in the woods, away from people, away from responsibilities. I had found a small cabin listed online, a rustic place deep in a forested area, miles from the nearest town. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, sturdy looking with a stone chimney and a small porch overlooking a clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The listing emphasized peace and solitude, and the reviews were positive, though they were sparse, which suited me perfectly. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun high enough to illuminate the dirt road leading to the cabin. Driving the last stretch, I realized that the road had not been used in a long time. Grass grew in the center of the path, and deep ruts from past tires made it bumpy. My small rental car handled it slowly, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly as I maneuvered over uneven terrain. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, a wave of relief washed over me. It looked exactly like it had in the pictures, only more isolated than I had imagined. There were no other houses in sight, no sounds of traffic, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow. I took a deep breath, feeling a kind of excited calmness, the kind that comes when you step completely out of your everyday life. The cabin itself smelled faintly of wood and dust. The interior was simple, a living area with a small sofa and a worn rug, a stone fireplace, a kitchenette with basic supplies, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked only slightly more comfortable than a camping cot. The windows were thick, old glass with small cracks in places. Everything had a rustic charm, but it was clear this cabin had been unused for a while. The floors creaked under my weight, the hinges on the doors groaned, and the air had that dry, slightly musty smell that comes with places left closed up for months. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting up my sleeping area, and exploring the cabin thoroughly. I checked every lock, every window latch, and even the small cellar under the floorboards. I liked to know where everything was in case something went wrong. By mid-afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was dense but not unnavigable. I noticed animal tracks, deer, squirrels, and smaller birds, but nothing that looked threatening. Still, I was cautious. I had read warnings about bears and mountain lions, but the chances were slim, and I had packed a modest amount of bear spray and a sturdy walking stick just in case. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that seems to amplify every sound. I could hear twigs snapping under my feet, the occasional rustle of branches, and the wind moving through the trees. I walked for several hours, following trails that twisted and turned in ways I did not fully understand. Eventually, I returned to the cabin as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that made the woods look suddenly more menacing. That first night was uneventful but uneasy. I ate a simple meal of canned soup and bread, then sat by the fireplace reading a book I had brought with me. The wind outside had picked up, causing branches to scratch against the cabin walls. Every sound seemed louder in the isolation. I reminded myself constantly that it was all natural noises. Animals, wind, nothing more. Yet sleep did not come easily. I woke several times to every minor creak, every thump from outside, convinced it could be something more than just the house settling or a deer moving in the underbrush. The second day, I decided to explore further, hiking along a narrow trail that appeared on a rough map I had found in the cabin. The trail was overgrown in places, forcing me to push through branches and brush. I noticed that the forest seemed denser here, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in thin shafts. It was beautiful in a serene, almost hypnotic way, but a nagging sense of being watched tugged at the back of my mind. I shook it off repeatedly, telling myself it was just my imagination. As afternoon approached, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The trail had disappeared under fallen leaves and branches, and there were no markers to indicate the way back. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. Thick trunks, twisted roots, and occasional glimpses of the sky through the leaves. Panic was slow to rise, but it began to bubble under the surface. I was lost in the forest, miles from the cabin, and the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Shadows grew long, twisting the forest into shapes that seemed almost sinister. I tried to remain calm, breathing slowly and analyzing my situation logically. I had a compass and a map, and I had been following the sun to approximate westward, toward the cabin. I moved carefully, aware of the uneven ground, tripping over roots and loose stones. The forest seemed endless, and every direction looked the same. I stopped frequently to listen, hoping to hear the faintest sound of the cabin or the road leading there, but there was nothing, only the wind and occasional animal cries. Night fell faster than I expected, and my unease turned into real fear. I had a small flashlight, but the batteries were already weak. I debated whether to try to keep moving in the dark or to stay put until morning. Ultimately, I decided to move, hoping that the path would reveal itself with patience and careful observation. Each step was slow, deliberate. My heart raced with every sound. I began noticing strange things: broken branches that looked like footprints, small piles of animal droppings in places I hadn't seen before. It was all natural. I knew that, yet my mind kept finding patterns that made me imagine shapes and eyes in the darkness. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, I stumbled upon a small clearing. Relief flooded me. I recognized the clearing. I had passed it on my initial hike in the afternoon. The sight of it brought a temporary sense of calm. From here, I could make out the faint silhouette of the cabin through the trees. It was farther than I had thought, but visible. I forced myself to move toward it steadily, careful not to trip or twist an ankle. The forest, which had seemed endless and threatening just moments before, began to feel navigable again. When I finally reached the cabin, I was exhausted, my clothes torn in places from branches, dirt covering my shoes and legs. I locked the door behind me, leaned against it, and took several deep breaths. I felt the adrenaline leave my body in waves, replaced by a profound sense of relief. I prepared a hot meal, ate slowly, and sat by the fire until the early hours of the morning, contemplating the fragility of my situation. The next few days passed more smoothly, though the underlying tension never fully disappeared. I explored carefully during daylight, marking trails and leaving small markers to ensure I would not become lost again. I reinforced the cabin windows and doors, swept out debris, and created a small perimeter with rocks and sticks to give myself a psychological sense of security. Each night, I slept lightly, always alert to the sounds outside. I grew more attuned to the rhythms of the forest, the rustle of animals, the distant calls of birds, the way the wind moved through the trees. Over time, the fear became manageable, replaced by a deep respect for the isolation and unpredictability of the wilderness. Midway through the week, a storm rolled in. Rain hammered against the roof and windows, the wind howling through the trees. I was trapped inside, the world outside transformed into a blur of water and wind. At first, I panicked again, imagining branches breaking and falling on the cabin, rivers of water cutting through the forest. I reminded myself of the sturdiness of the structure and that the storm was temporary. I spent hours checking the windows, securing loose boards, and listening to the rain, learning to endure the anxiety through practical measures and constant awareness. The storm passed by late evening, leaving the forest glistening with wet leaves and mud. The air was fresh, almost sweet after the heavy rainfall. I stepped outside cautiously, taking in the changed landscape. Fallen branches and leaves were scattered everywhere. The small path I had made clear before was partially washed away, and the smell of wet earth filled my senses. I felt a strange satisfaction. I had survived the storm, a real, tangible threat that reminded me of my vulnerability but also of my resilience. In the final days of my stay, I focused on preparation for leaving. I organized my belongings, cleaned the cabin as best I could, and packed supplies for the journey back. On the last morning, I took a long walk through the forest, appreciating the beauty and solitude that had both terrified and inspired me. The cabin, now familiar and almost comforting, stood silently among the trees. I understood that the fear I had experienced was natural, a product of isolation, uncertainty, and the unpredictability of the wilderness. It had taught me vigilance, patience, and respect for the environment. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was somewhere deep in the northern woods, far from the nearest town, and I had never been anywhere so isolated. The idea of spending a week alone, with nothing but the forest, the lake, and the cabin itself, sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. I had been working non-stop for months, and the thought of quiet, uninterrupted days in the middle of nature was almost intoxicating. I had packed carefully, enough food to last the week, plenty of bottled water, a first aid kit, warm clothes, and the basic tools for survival. My car was packed with extra blankets, a portable stove, a flashlight, batteries, and my old, trusty camping knife. Everything was ready, and I felt confident. I thought I knew what solitude felt like, but I had no idea. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had anticipated. I had mapped the route carefully, but as the miles passed, paved roads gave way to gravel, and gravel roads gave way to dirt tracks barely wide enough for a car. The GPS signal flickered on and off, and eventually disappeared entirely. That was okay. I had the directions printed out, and I had been careful to memorize the few key turns. When the last stretch came into view, a narrow track between dense trees, I slowed to a crawl. The air was thick and still, the trees standing tall and shadowed over the path. The sun was already dipping low, streaks of gold catching the tops of the pines, casting long shadows across the road. By the time I saw the cabin, it was almost dark. It sat back from the track, a modest wooden structure, clearly built decades ago but still sturdy. The paint had faded to gray, the roof showing signs of wear, but it looked solid. A small dock extended out over the lake in front, and a stone chimney jutted from the side, blackened from countless fires over the years. I parked the car on the uneven patch of grass and got out, stretching my arms and shoulders. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent I had missed more than I realized. It was quiet, more quiet than I had expected. Even though the lake lapped gently against the shore, the stillness of the forest made every sound more noticeable. The distant snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the faint call of a bird. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The air smelled musty, a mixture of old wood, dust, and the faint residue of smoke from the fireplace. The cabin was small, but it had everything I needed. A single room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, a small bathroom, and a loft with a mattress and blankets. I set my bags down and began unpacking, organizing food and water, stacking firewood near the stove, and making sure the flashlights and batteries were in easy reach. By the time I was done, the sun had fully set. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, heavy and complete. I lit the stove and made myself a simple dinner, canned beans heated in a pot with a few crackers I had brought along. I sat on the edge of the mattress and ate slowly, listening to the occasional sounds of the forest. The soft croak of a frog, the flutter of wings, the wind moving through the treetops. Felt calm, even comforting. I washed the dishes, stacked them neatly, and then decided to take a walk outside before night fully set in. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the uneven ground. The lake reflected the moonlight, a silver path stretching toward the dark woods on the far side. The air was crisp, and the slight chill made me pull my jacket tighter around me. I walked down to the dock and sat on the edge, dangling my feet over the water. For a moment, I let myself breathe, feeling removed from the pressures of life, completely alone with only the natural world. As I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange: tracks in the mud near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought they were raccoon tracks, small and irregular, but as I crouched closer, I realized they were larger than anything I would expect from wildlife around here. They were boot prints, human-shaped, deep and clearly defined. My stomach sank. The tracks came from the forest and led toward the cabin, stopping near the edge of the cleared area where I had parked my car. There was no way I could have noticed them earlier in the daylight, but now, in the fading moonlight, they were unmistakable. I checked the ground near the car, no footprints leading away. Whoever had been here hadn't gone back the way they came. My pulse quickened. I reminded myself to stay calm. Could be a hunter or a ranger, someone who had wandered close and left tracks. But the thought did little to calm me. The forest suddenly felt larger, heavier, and somehow more threatening. I locked the cabin doors and windows again, double-checking each one. I went back inside, turning off the flashlight and letting the faint light of the moon through the windows illuminate the room. I set the knife on the table near the stove, within reach, and tried to tell myself it was unlikely anyone would come here at night, especially not intentionally. The cabin was remote, the path rough and difficult. Most people wouldn't make the effort, but that thought did not stop the unease creeping into my mind. Every shadow outside seemed to shift, every sound amplified. I checked the perimeter with my flashlight, shining it across the yard and the edge of the woods. Nothing moved. Still, sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning, I awoke early, shivering slightly. I had left the window slightly open for ventilation, and the breeze coming in had chilled me overnight. I made coffee, ate a simple breakfast, and went outside to survey the area in daylight. The tracks were still there, now more obvious in the clear light. They weren't fresh, perhaps left overnight, but they were human, undeniably. My heart pounded, but I reminded myself to remain logical. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Could have been a hiker or a hunter, maybe someone who had wandered through without realizing anyone was here. I decided to focus on my tasks for the day, gathering firewood, checking the dock, and exploring the small path that led deeper into the forest. Keeping busy helped ease the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I moved from one part of the cabin to another, I glanced at the treeline, half expecting to see someone standing there. By the second day, I had begun to settle into a routine. I would wake early, make coffee, and spend the day walking or preparing meals. I discovered the lake was shallow near the dock but deepened quickly. I even went for a swim, though cautiously, always scanning the treeline. The first morning, I saw signs that someone had returned during the night, fresh tracks near the cabin again, this time around the back. Whoever it was had circled the cabin, careful not to leave a direct path in or out, but still, the impression of their presence was unmistakable. I considered leaving immediately, but I had come prepared for a week, and the isolation, while nerve-wracking, was still manageable. I reinforced the doors and windows, set a few noisy obstacles, rocks and sticks that would clatter if stepped on, and made a plan to stay vigilant. The nights were the hardest. Every creak of the cabin, every wind gust, every animal noise triggered a spike of fear. I would lie awake, listening to the forest, my flashlight at arm's length, scanning the dark. Once, I heard rustling near the dock. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it over the water. Nothing. Later, I found broken reeds and mud disturbed along the shoreline, as if someone had been waiting near the edge. My mind tried to rationalize it. An animal, the wind, something I hadn't noticed, but the human-shaped tracks nearby reminded me otherwise. Someone had been close, perhaps even watching from the trees. I began to take measures I hadn't anticipated. I cleared the area immediately around the cabin, removing branches and undergrowth that could conceal someone. I made sure the doors were bolted from the inside and set heavy objects against the more vulnerable windows. I even started carrying the knife with me constantly, though I hated the idea of it. I checked my phone signal repeatedly, still nothing, and realized that if someone were to approach, I would be completely on my own. It was a sobering realization. The solitude I had craved now felt like a trap. The next night, I stayed awake almost the entire time. I kept the lights off and listened. At first, everything was quiet, almost unbearably so. Then, faint sounds reached my ears, footsteps on the ground outside, deliberate and slow. My heart leapt. I held my breath and tried to track the sounds, but the darkness was dense, hiding everything beyond a few feet. The footsteps circled the cabin, then paused. My pulse thundered in my ears. I gripped the knife and waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep until dawn. When daylight came, I dared to inspect the perimeter. The tracks were fresh, clearly human, and had come incredibly close to the cabin. Whoever it was had been careful, staying just at the edge of the trees, but the message was clear. I was being observed. Panic was tempting, but I forced myself to think logically. Leaving immediately would be dangerous, given the remote roads and rough terrain. Instead, I devised a plan. I had been planning this trip for months, and the excitement had built up to a point where I could hardly sleep the night before leaving. I wanted a break from the city, from the constant noise and the constant pressure. The idea of a cabin in the woods, completely isolated, completely disconnected, felt like the perfect solution. I had rented a small wooden cabin deep in the forest, a place where even cell service was spotty at best. I knew it would be quiet, maybe even too quiet, but that was exactly what I wanted. I loaded my old, dented backpack with supplies: food, water, clothes, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a small camping stove. I had deliberately kept it minimal because I didn't want the trip to feel like a camping expedition. I wanted comfort within solitude. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had expected. The roads became narrower, turning into winding paths with dense trees pressing in from both sides. The kind of trees that filter out sunlight, leaving the road dim even in the middle of the day. At some points, I had to slow down so I wouldn't hit a branch or a stray deer. The engine of my car felt too loud in the thick silence of the forest. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter when I saw a small, weathered sign pointing toward the cabin, almost hidden by overgrown shrubs. Havenwood Cabin, it read, scratched and fading. The thought that no one probably used that road often crossed my mind, but I brushed it off. That was part of the appeal. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. A 2-story wooden structure with a small porch, a stone chimney, and a single, narrow dirt path leading up to it. The air was different immediately, thicker, cooler, cleaner. It smelled of damp wood and moss, of pine needles crushed underfoot. I parked my car in a small clearing just off the path and grabbed my backpack. The cabin door creaked when I opened it, and the smell inside was strong, almost overpowering. A mix of old wood, dust, and dampness. The cabin hadn't been cleaned properly in a while, I guessed, but it didn't matter. I wanted solitude, and this place promised it. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. There was a living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen corner, and a staircase leading to a loft that served as a bedroom. The furniture was old but sturdy. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small sofa that looked like it had been reupholstered once but not recently, and a few shelves with dusty books. The windows were dirty, making the outside world look slightly blurred, like a painting. I set down my backpack and took a deep breath. This was it. I was alone, and I intended to stay that way for the next few days. The first day passed uneventfully. I unpacked, organized my supplies, and explored the small clearing around the cabin. The forest was dense, and the sunlight barely reached the ground in some areas. I marked a few trees along the path with chalk from my backpack, just in case I wandered too far. I wanted to feel safe in this isolation, and that meant knowing my boundaries. I made a small fire outside in a stone ring near the porch and cooked some canned beans. The sound of the crackling fire was soothing, the only interruption being the occasional bird or rustle of leaves. Night came, and I went to bed early, feeling calm, almost blissful. The second day started with the usual morning routine: a cup of instant coffee, some bread, and a little fruit I had packed. I decided to go for a longer walk along a trail I noticed the day before. The trail went deeper into the forest, winding around a small creek and then disappearing into thick underbrush. I kept my backpack on, carrying water and my flashlight just in case. About an hour in, I realized the trail wasn't marked, and I didn't remember the last turn I had taken. The forest looked the same in every direction. Tall, straight trees, thick ferns, fallen branches, and shadows. I tried to retrace my steps, but soon noticed that the path I thought I had taken didn't exist anymore. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt the first genuine pangs of fear. I was in the middle of nowhere with no one around to help. I checked my phone. No signal. Nothing. I calmed myself by sitting down on a fallen log, trying to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help. I looked around carefully, trying to find any landmark I could remember. The sun was moving, so I had a rough idea of direction. I decided to follow the creek downstream, reasoning that water might lead to civilization or at least back to the cabin. It was slow going. The ground was uneven, slippery with moss, and my shoes were starting to get wet. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird. Each noise made me flinch. Hours passed, and my legs were growing sore, my backpack increasingly heavy. Eventually, I spotted something unusual. A small, abandoned cabin, almost hidden behind a dense cluster of trees. Its windows were broken, the door hanging loose. My instinct was to avoid it, but curiosity won. I approached cautiously. The smell was strong, rotten wood and mold, and I could see remnants of old furniture inside. I didn't stay long. I needed to focus on getting back, not exploring. I marked the cabin's location mentally, just in case I needed a temporary shelter. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and hungry. I realized I had wandered far off the trail and was beginning to panic again. Shadows lengthened, and the forest was darkening rapidly. I tried yelling, hoping the sound would carry, but there was no response. I knew I couldn't keep walking aimlessly. I remembered the creek and decided to follow it again, hoping it would loop back toward the main path or my cabin. My steps became sluggish, my energy fading. Around dusk, I stumbled upon a steep incline that looked familiar. I climbed carefully and, to my relief, found a section of the trail I had seen earlier. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with the knowledge of how easily I could have gotten lost completely. I hurried back to the cabin as darkness fully descended, grateful for the dim light filtering from the porch. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made me tense. A deer brushed against the undergrowth, a branch cracked, and I flinched every time. I stayed close to the fireplace, even though I didn't light it, keeping my backpack nearby. I realized how little I had prepared for total isolation and how fragile the sense of safety really was. The thought of being alone in this forest, hours away from anyone, gnawed at me. I resolved to be more cautious the next day. On the third day, I spent most of the morning cleaning the cabin. I swept the floor, wiped down surfaces, and even tried to clean the windows enough to see the outside more clearly. The act of tidying up gave me a sense of control over the environment. I made a checklist of supplies, noting that my food was limited and that I needed to ration carefully. Then I decided to explore another trail that appeared to be a shortcut to a nearby hill. I figured that if I could reach higher ground, I might spot the cabin from a distance or find a better sense of direction. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and far less traveled. My legs scratched against branches, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs constantly. I kept telling myself it was all part of the adventure, but the unease lingered, a small, persistent tension in my chest. About halfway up the hill, I found evidence of recent human activity. A small fire pit, partially burned logs, and footprints in the soft earth. I paused, noticing that the prints weren't old. Someone had been here, possibly living off the forest temporarily. The thought both comforted me and unsettled me. Comforted because I wasn't completely alone in the area. Unsettled because I didn't know who that person was or why they were here. I moved cautiously, taking mental notes of landmarks to retrace my steps later. As the sun began to drop toward the horizon, I realized I had been moving too far from the cabin and decided to head back before dark. The descent was treacherous, the dirt loose, and my shoes slipping repeatedly. By the time I reached the cabin, my muscles were sore, and my legs were covered in scratches from branches and ferns. That evening, I made a fire in the fireplace. I had learned by now that it wasn't just about warmth, it was about comfort and a sense of security. Sitting near the flames, I ate a simple meal, feeling my nerves settle slightly. The sounds of the forest had not changed, but somehow they felt less threatening in the presence of fire. I reviewed my supplies again and made plans for the next day. More exploration, more mapping, and strict boundaries to avoid getting lost again. The fear of losing my way had embedded itself in my mind, and I wasn't willing to take chances. The fourth day began with overcast skies and a damp chill in the air. I decided to explore cautiously along the main trail, the one that seemed most reliable. I wanted to see how far it extended and whether it might lead to any road or signs of civilization. I carried extra water, a small knife, and my flashlight. The trail wound through thick forest and open patches of scrubland. The smell of wet earth was strong, and small animals I had been planning the cabin trip for months, trying to escape the constant noise and chaos of the city. The thought of being alone in the woods, surrounded by silence and the smell of pine, had been incredibly appealing. I wanted to go off-grid for a few days, to be disconnected, and to just exist without anything pressing on me. The cabin I found was small, old, but structurally sound. It was advertised as remote, which was perfect. I packed my gear with care. Enough food for a week, plenty of bottled water, a stove, extra blankets, a small first aid kit, and my flashlight with backup batteries. I even brought a small camping axe and a machete, mostly as a precaution, but the forest I was going into was known to have wildlife, and I wanted to feel secure. The drive out was long. I left early in the morning to avoid traffic, and by the time I got to the last town before the woods, the sky was already turning pale with the light of early afternoon. The last few miles were on an unpaved dirt road, winding through dense trees that seemed to grow taller as I drove further. The car jostled over rocks and deep ruts, and at times I felt I might be stuck in the mud if I slowed down. The isolation started to sink in almost immediately, and a small thrill ran through me. No neighbors, no strangers, just the forest and me. I checked the GPS once, though I knew the signal would fade as I drove deeper, and noted the remaining distance. When I finally saw the cabin, it felt both inviting and ominous. It was made of old pine logs, darkened by years of exposure to rain and snow. Moss covered parts of the roof, and a thin column of smoke curled faintly from the chimney. The windows were small, and the glass had the kind of slight distortion that made it hard to see inside clearly. A narrow footpath led from the dirt road to the cabin's door, overgrown with weeds and fallen leaves. I parked the car on the edge of the path, careful not to block any imaginary visitor that might come. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and walked up the path. Each step crunched over leaves and twigs, and I realized that my presence might be announced for miles in the silence of the woods. The cabin interior was rustic, with a single large room, a small kitchen area, and a loft for sleeping. The smell of old wood and a faint moldy scent greeted me immediately. I set down my bag, checked that all the doors and windows locked properly, and began unpacking. I stacked firewood by the stone fireplace, checked the stove, and organized my food in the cupboards. Everything seemed fine, but there was a subtle heaviness in the air. Not in a supernatural sense, just in a very real, almost suffocating way, like the forest outside was pressing against the walls of the cabin. It wasn't frightening yet, just strange. I spent the first afternoon exploring the immediate surroundings. The forest was thick, full of tall pines and undergrowth that made it hard to see far. There were tracks on the dirt path, some from deer, some likely from raccoons or foxes. I marked a few trees near the cabin with ribbon in case I got disoriented. The sunlight was fading, and I knew I had only a short window before it would be dark. I returned to the cabin, made a small fire, and cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice. The first night, I slept fitfully, partly from excitement, partly because the unfamiliar sounds outside, the snapping branches, the rustling leaves, the distant cry of a bird, kept me alert. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, making a constant, low moan that I initially thought was the structure settling but gradually felt more deliberate, like the forest itself was alive around me. By the second day, I was starting to feel the isolation more intensely. I wandered further along a small creek near the cabin, enjoying the sight of the water rushing over smooth stones, the sun hitting patches of moss. I noticed that the forest, though beautiful, could be extremely disorienting. Every tree looked similar, and it was easy to forget which direction I had come from. I reminded myself constantly of the path back, marking small symbols on the trees. On that day, I noticed something strange. A series of footprints near the creek that were human but unusually large. At first, I thought perhaps a hunter had passed recently. I followed them briefly, but they led off into thicker woods where visibility was low. I didn't pursue them further. I just made a mental note to be more careful. Night came again, and this time I made a larger fire, both for light and for the sense of security it provided. I had left the cabin windows unlocked slightly for ventilation, but I had double-checked the doors. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside, subtle but distinct. Footsteps, crunching over leaves near the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. My heart rate spiked immediately. I stayed absolutely still, listening. The steps paused, then moved slowly around the cabin's perimeter. I didn't make any sudden movements. After what felt like forever, they receded, but I stayed awake for hours, listening to every creak, snap, and rustle outside. I rationalized that it could be a deer or a bear, but the rhythm was too regular for that. I could almost feel someone or something watching from the shadows just beyond the firelight. The next morning, I searched around the cabin thoroughly. There were no signs of forced entry, but I found small items from my firewood pile moved slightly. Not enough to suggest someone had been inside, but enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. The footprints by the creek were gone, replaced by lighter impressions, like they had been obscured by wind or rain. My unease grew, but I forced myself to carry on. I had come here to enjoy solitude and nature, and I refused to let fear ruin that. I kept my knife accessible, my flashlight ready, and made sure the firewood was stacked in a way that gave me a line of sight to the clearing. The following days were a tense routine. I explored cautiously, made frequent trips to the creek for water, and kept mental notes of landmarks. Each night, I double-checked every door and window, sometimes adding improvised barricades with furniture. I never saw anyone, but the feeling of being watched never went away. On the fourth day, I decided to venture farther, hoping that moving away from the immediate vicinity would reduce my tension. I walked along a narrow ridge I had spotted from the cabin. The forest canopy was thick, and the undergrowth snagged at my pants and shoes. About an hour in, I noticed clear human-made marks on the trees, scratches deliberate and repeated. Something about them was aggressive, urgent. I felt my stomach tighten. These were no casual marks by a hiker. Someone had been here, maybe recently, and the energy of it felt hostile. I turned back quickly, keeping an eye on the shadows and listening for any sound of pursuit. Returning to the cabin, I locked everything securely and decided to stay inside for the remainder of the day. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, and I reminded myself that this isolation was part of the experience. Still, fear was creeping in. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been observing me since the first night. I resolved to make some noise on purpose the next morning, walking a larger perimeter to see if anyone approached. The next day, I spent hours making my presence known, shouting, banging sticks, and rustling around the outer trees. Nothing happened. It was both reassuring and unnerving. If someone was here, they had chosen not to reveal themselves. On the fifth night, I had a more concrete scare. I had gone to the creek earlier to collect water, and on the way back, I saw a figure at the edge of the clearing. My first instinct was disbelief. Was it a trick of the trees, a shadow cast in the firelight? But no, it was definitely a person, crouching near a tree, watching. I froze, holding my breath, and waited. After a few minutes, they moved slowly, retreating into the woods. I did not pursue, instead rushing back to the cabin and securing everything tightly. That night, I slept in shifts, half an hour at a time, waking every few minutes to check the windows. The fear was real, primal. I realized this was no longer about solitude. This was about safety. The next morning, I decided I would leave immediately. I packed everything, double-checked the cabin, and began the long walk back to my car. I stayed alert, constantly scanning the trees for movement, every sound making me jump. The walk back seemed longer than the drive in. The forest had gone from a place of peace to one of tension and constant vigilance. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my car, relief flooded me. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving back, I kept the doors locked and watched the woods closely, half expecting someone to appear along the edges of the road. By the time I reached the first town, the tension had lessened. I parked at a gas station, bought a soda, and sat for a long while, letting the hum of civilization soak into me. The experience had been harrowing, but I also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I had faced real fear, not the kind conjured by stories or imagination, but the kind that comes from knowing another person could be nearby with unknown intent. The forest had been indifferent, beautiful, and dangerous all at once. I realized that I had planned the trip for months, meticulously researching every detail, every potential pitfall, and imagining every way it could go wrong. I needed a break, a complete escape from the city, from the constant noise and pressure, from people and obligations. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, and it promised solitude. That solitude was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, double-checking my gear. A heavy-duty backpack, food for a week, a large water container, extra clothes, first aid supplies, a flashlight with spare batteries, a map, a compass, and a well-worn hunting knife. I even carried a small hand axe, just in case I needed it for firewood or an emergency. I didn't leave anything to chance. The drive to the trailhead was long and quiet, the kind of long that makes you feel your thoughts echo. The forest was dense, the trees dark and close, their shadows stretching over the road like hands. I parked in a small clearing, checked my gear again, and started the hike. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding through dense underbrush and across small streams. The air smelled sharp and fresh, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves was constant. Every step felt like a commitment, a step further from safety, but also a step deeper into the kind of isolation I craved. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was low, filtering through the canopy in long, golden shafts. It was exactly as pictured. Small, rustic, built from weathered logs, with a stone chimney and a sturdy front door. A thin layer of dust covered the windows, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine. I left my pack by the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple but functional. A wooden table and chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, a wood-burning stove, and shelves lined with canned goods left by previous renters. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just the bare essentials. That simplicity was comforting. I unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. The crackling of the fire and the smell of burning wood filled the cabin, creating a feeling of security and warmth. Night fell quickly. Without streetlights, the forest outside was pitch black, a solid wall of darkness punctuated only by the occasional flicker of a distant animal's eyes or the glint of moonlight on the leaves. I checked my supplies again, made sure my knife and axe were within reach, and settled onto the bed with a flashlight on the table. That first night passed without incident, though I could hear animals moving outside. Small creatures rustling through the underbrush, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Their sounds were unsettling at first, but eventually they became a sort of background music to the forest. The next day, I explored the surrounding area, marking familiar landmarks, collecting dry wood for the fire, and refilling my water container from a small stream nearby. The trail to the stream was narrow and treacherous, with slippery rocks and fallen branches, and I moved slowly and carefully. Everything seemed normal, calm, routine, but there was a certain tension in the air, a subtle unease that I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't fear at first, just a heightened awareness. I noticed the way the shadows shifted, how the wind sounded different through certain trees, and how the forest seemed unnaturally quiet in some places, as if it were holding its breath. That night, I prepared more thoroughly. I placed extra wood near the stove, positioned my knife within reach, and checked the lock on the door. I lay in bed listening to the forest, the sounds closer, louder, more deliberate. At some point, I heard a snapping branch outside, close to the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. Then another, softer, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, slowly moving toward the window. Outside, nothing was visible in the darkness. I peered through the glass, shining the light carefully, but the shadows seemed to absorb it. My pulse quickened, my skin prickling. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe a fox, but the rational part of me couldn't completely convince the rest. The next morning, I found something unusual. My firewood pile had been disturbed. A log was moved slightly, leaving an imprint in the dirt that suggested something had walked around it. The tracks were faint but distinct, human-shaped, size uncertain. My stomach sank. I checked the cabin thoroughly. Doors locked, windows shut. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but the implication was clear. Someone had been here, possibly watching, possibly following. The rational part of me tried to reason it away. Maybe another hiker or someone else renting nearby. But the location was remote, and the trailhead had been empty when I arrived. I spent the next day on edge, moving cautiously outside, keeping an eye on the forest while performing my tasks. I collected more firewood, replenished water, and explored further, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every movement in the shadows, every rustle of leaves, made my heart jump. By late afternoon, I had decided to stay close to the cabin, not venturing far, keeping all tools within arm's reach. Night fell again. I double-checked the locks, placed extra rocks in front of the door as a barrier, and sat by the fire, listening. Around midnight, the noise started. Soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I held my breath, frozen, listening as they moved back and forth. I considered leaving immediately, but the darkness outside made that impossible without a flashlight, and even then, I would be a target. I grabbed my axe, keeping it close, and waited. The footsteps continued for hours, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving again. I couldn't see anyone, and the forest absorbed all sounds beyond a certain distance. When dawn finally arrived, the footsteps had stopped. I cautiously stepped outside, checking the perimeter. There were tracks all around the cabin. Multiple sets, too many to count, human-shaped, some larger than others. I realized they hadn't been random. Someone had been watching, testing, possibly planning. My mind raced, thinking of what to do. I could hike out immediately, but that meant carrying all my gear through uncertain terrain, risking a confrontation. I could stay put, wait, and hope they left, but that could last days. I made a plan. I packed quickly, gathering essentials: water, food, flashlight, knife, and axe. I left a note on the table, just in case someone found the cabin after me. I intended to move quietly, staying low, avoiding the main trail as much as possible. I waited until late morning, watching the forest. There were no signs of movement, but I knew better than to trust appearances. Slowly, carefully, I stepped onto the trail, keeping my eyes and ears open. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I moved deliberately, keeping to cover, changing direction when necessary, avoiding open clearings. The hike out was tense, exhausting, mentally and physically. I moved slower than usual, listening for any sign of pursuit. At one point, I heard a snapping branch behind me and froze. I waited, heart pounding, holding my breath. After a few minutes, nothing. I kept moving, cautious, constantly scanning. Hours passed, the forest dense and unrelenting. I drank water sparingly, took short breaks in hidden spots, and maintained constant vigilance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the road. The sight of a car passing by filled me with relief, a sense of safety I hadn't felt for days. I ran toward it, waving my arms, shouting. The driver stopped, startled, but eventually took me into town. Once I was in a populated area, surrounded by people, safe from the isolation of the forest, I began to breathe again. I called the authorities, reported the cabin and the tracks. They investigated and confirmed my suspicion. Someone had been following visitors in that area, watching them, entering cabins when unoccupied. My quick thinking and careful attention had kept me safe, and I had avoided a potentially dangerous encounter. I stayed in town that night, sleeping in a secure, well-lit hotel. I couldn't shake the memories of the forest, the footsteps circling my cabin, the sound of branches snapping in the darkness. But I also felt a sense of triumph. My caution, preparation, and alertness had kept me safe. The experience left me shaken, but it also reinforced the importance of awareness and planning. I returned home a few days later, grateful for the safety of familiar surroundings, but I never forgot the forest, the cabin, and the sense of being watched in the deepest isolation. I never went back, and I never will, but the memory stayed with me, a vivid reminder of how quickly solitude can turn into danger. I had been planning to spend a week alone at the cabin deep in the woods. It was supposed to be quiet, away from the city noise, and a chance to clear my head. I had bought supplies days before: canned food, rice, pasta, instant coffee, a couple of lanterns, extra batteries, and a small propane stove. I also packed a heavy flashlight, a folding knife, and a small first aid kit. My plan was simple: drive out early in the morning, hike up the last part of the trail where the dirt road ended, and stay inside the cabin without needing to go anywhere for at least a week. The drive itself was about 3 hours. I left just before sunrise, my car loaded with gear. The last part of the road was gravel, rough in places, with thick trees pressing in close. I saw no other cars, no houses, just forest. When I parked at the trailhead, the silence was thick. It was late fall, so the leaves were mostly gone from the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I strapped on my pack and carried 2 large plastic bags of food and gear, making 2 trips up to the cabin. The cabin was small, built of old dark logs. It had one main room with a wood stove, a little table, a bed against the wall, and a tiny back room that was hardly bigger than a closet. The windows had shutters that latched from the inside. There was no running water or electricity. I had brought a water container that I filled from the nearby stream. By the time I had everything unpacked, I was sweating from the work. I boiled some stream water to be safe, ate a quick meal, and then sat on the front step looking out over the woods. It was quiet, except for the occasional crow and the faint trickle of the stream down the slope. I thought it would be peaceful, but even on the first day, I had the feeling that the silence was heavier than I expected. The first night, I lit the propane lantern and sat reading until late. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. I made sure the door was bolted. I lay in the bed, wrapped in a sleeping bag, listening. I could hear small sounds in the woods, branches snapping, what could have been small animals moving. I told myself it was normal, but the longer I lay there, the more I noticed that the noises didn't sound like random animals. Sometimes they seemed to stop and start in a way that made me think something was watching the cabin. On the second day, I chopped some wood for the stove, walked down to the stream to wash up, and tried to relax. But when I returned, I noticed something strange. Near the cabin, just beyond the clearing, the ground was disturbed. The leaves were pressed down, like someone had been standing there for a long time. There were faint impressions in the dirt. They weren't clear enough to be shoe prints, but the size and shape made me think they were. I crouched down and studied them. They looked recent. The unease I felt grew stronger. I tried to brush it off as my imagination. Maybe they were old. Maybe they were just marks from deer hooves. I went back inside, but I kept looking out the window all afternoon. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside, moving slowly on the dry leaves. I lay completely still, heart hammering. The sound moved around the cabin, then stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound. I forced myself to get up quietly, turned off the lantern, and peered through a crack in the shutter. It was too dark to see anything. The next morning, I checked again outside. About 10 feet from the cabin, near the trees, I found something that made my stomach twist. A cigarette butt. It was fresh, not even wet from dew. I don't smoke. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. That meant someone had been close to the cabin during the night. I tried to think logically. Maybe some hunter was passing through. Maybe a hiker had camped nearby. But the trail was not well used, and hunting season wasn't open here. The thought that someone had come up quietly at night and stood near the cabin unsettled me more than I can describe. For the next 2 days, I stayed alert. I barely left the cabin except to fetch water quickly. I made sure to lock the shutters and bolt the door every night. Still, I kept hearing noises. Not constant, but enough that I knew I wasn't imagining them. Crunches on leaves, faint snaps of branches. Sometimes what sounded like a cough carried faintly on the wind. On the 4th day, I walked a little farther down the stream, trying to shake off the cabin fever. When I came back, I noticed the cabin door was slightly ajar. I froze. I knew for a fact I had bolted it before I left. My heart pounded as I slowly approached. Inside, nothing looked stolen, but I saw small changes. My backpack had been shifted. The food bags weren't where I had left them. On the table, one of my knives was lying out. I never put it there. I searched every corner of the cabin, even the tiny back room, but there was no one. Still, it was clear someone had been inside while I was gone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern low, sat with my back to the wall, and listened. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the creak of a board outside the porch. Slow, deliberate. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight. The sound stayed there for a long time, then eventually faded. By morning, I decided I couldn't take much more. I started packing some of my things, planning to leave the next day. But when I went outside, I saw something that made the decision for me. On the dirt path leading up to the cabin, someone had drawn a line across the trail with a stick. A straight, deliberate line right where I would walk out. It wasn't natural. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound. When night came, I shut everything tight again and sat in the dark, listening. Sometime after midnight, the sounds began again. Soft footsteps circling. Then, a slow dragging sound along the cabin wall, like a stick being pulled across the logs. It went around the entire cabin, stopping under the window where I sat. I held my breath. I felt like whoever it was knew exactly where I was sitting. Hours seemed to pass before the sound stopped. I don't even remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the first gray light of morning was coming in. I didn't waste a second. I threw everything into my bag, grabbed the rest of my food, and stepped outside. That's when I saw the worst part. On the cabin door, scratched deep into the wood, was a single word: stay. I stood frozen, staring at it. My mind raced. Whoever was out there didn't want me to leave. Or maybe they wanted me to be too afraid to try. Either way, I knew I had to go. I didn't bother covering my tracks. I just hiked fast down to the car, constantly looking behind me. Every snap of a branch made me turn. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was there, but I saw something on the hood. A small dead bird, its neck twisted. I nearly dropped my keys, my hands shaking so bad. I shoved the bags inside, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. The whole drive, I kept glancing in the mirror, convinced I'd see another car behind me, but the road was empty. When I finally made it home hours later, the relief should have been overwhelming, but it wasn't. The fear stayed. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been near the cabin had been watching me for days, maybe even following me from the moment I arrived. They never tried to talk, never tried to show themselves clearly. They just made sure I knew I wasn't alone, and then they left that message to get inside my head. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the property a few months later, even though I lost money on it. I couldn't imagine setting foot there again. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside my own house. I get up, check every lock, check every window. I tell myself it's nothing, but I know what it's like to be watched. I know what it's like to have someone step just close enough to let you know you aren't safe, but never close enough to catch. And that's the part that never leaves. I had always liked being alone in quiet places. The noise of the city drained me, and most of the time I felt like I couldn't even think properly unless I got away for a while. So when a friend told me about an old cabin up in the woods that wasn't used anymore and said I could stay there for a few weeks, I decided to take it. It wasn't fancy, but it had 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and a small kitchen space. That was enough for me. I packed food, water, a sleeping bag, some basic tools, and a few notebooks because I thought I would spend the time writing and thinking. The first few days in the cabin felt peaceful. I had to adjust to the silence at night, because in the city there were always cars, sirens, voices, something going on. Here, there was only wind through the trees, and sometimes the sound of branches snapping in the dark, or the high-pitched cry of an animal far off. At first it made me feel nervous, but then I grew used to it. I spent the days walking down the narrow trails near the cabin, carrying water from a stream, and cutting small branches for the fire. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick pine forest, with only a dirt path leading back to the nearest gravel road, about 2 miles away. After that road, it was another 10 miles until you reached the highway. It meant I was completely on my own, but that was part of why I wanted to be there. On the 4th night, I noticed something that changed how I felt about the place. I was sitting by the wood stove, reading by lantern light. The air outside was colder than it had been before, and I had closed the shutters to block the wind. At some point, I thought I heard a soft sound, like crunching leaves or snow underfoot. I paused, held my breath, and listened. At first, I thought it was only an animal, maybe a deer moving around. But the steps didn't move away. They circled slowly, almost careful, around the edge of the clearing. It was different from how an animal would move. It sounded like someone was walking slowly on purpose. I turned off the lantern and sat there in the dark, waiting. The sound lasted for a few more minutes, then faded. The next morning, I went outside to check. Around the cabin, the ground was hard and covered with pine needles, so it didn't leave clear marks. But on the dirt path leading away, I saw what looked like a shoe print. Not boots like hikers usually wore, just a regular shoe, half pressed into the dirt. Could have been old, but it looked sharp and fresh. That was the first time I started to feel uneasy. I told myself maybe someone had passed by earlier in the day while I hadn't noticed, maybe someone hunting or just walking. Still, the cabin was supposed to be far off the usual paths. Nobody should have been there. I pushed it out of my mind and tried to keep busy. That night, the same thing happened again. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. They were slow, like before, moving around in a half circle. Then they stopped on the side near the shuttered window. The boards were thin, and I imagined someone standing only a few feet away, listening to me breathe inside. I sat in complete silence, not even moving, until the sound faded again. The following morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. This time I found a clear footprint in the soft patch near the stream. A left shoe, size around 10, the kind you'd see on any regular man. I stood there for a long time staring at it, the water from the stream running quietly nearby. There was no reason for anyone to be that close to my cabin, and the careful way they moved at night didn't feel like chance. From then on, my days changed. I started checking the tree line more often. I locked the cabin door from the inside even during daylight. At night, I stayed awake longer, waiting to hear the steps. Every time the sound came back, slow and deliberate, circling, stopping, then vanishing into the woods again. Whoever it was never knocked, never called out, never came close in the daylight. They only circled at night. I thought about leaving, but part of me wanted to understand what was happening. The path back to the road was long and narrow, and if someone was watching the cabin, then they might also be watching the path. I figured the safest place for me at that moment was still inside, with the door locked and the stove warm. One night, I stayed up until 3 in the morning, sitting by the window with the lantern off. Around 1, the sound came back. I could make out the faint crunch of shoes pressing into the soil. This time they stopped near the back wall, and I thought I heard breathing. Just faint enough, but steady, like someone standing still and waiting. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the handle of the hatchet I kept beside me. I wanted to rush outside with it, but I knew how foolish that would be. I had no idea if it was one person or more. If I went out into the dark, I would be the exposed one. When the sound drifted away again, I sat there until dawn, my eyes burning from staying awake. The next day, I tried to plan. I had only brought enough food for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I rationed. If this went on longer, I would have to go back down to town anyway. The question was whether to wait it out or leave sooner. I walked toward the stream again, and on the bank in the wet soil, I found a new print. This time it was clearer than ever, pointing straight toward the cabin. Whoever it was had been standing there, watching while I slept. By now, I was fully on edge. I barely ate, my stomach too tight with nerves. I double-checked the shutters, stacked wood against the inside of the door, and made sure the hatchet was always within reach. That night, the footsteps didn't just circle. They came right up to the wall and pressed close, scraping lightly against the boards as though a hand brushed them. My chest felt like it would burst from the pressure of keeping still. The sound stayed longer this time, maybe 20 minutes, then finally pulled back. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. The person wasn't going to stop. I decided the next morning I would pack what I could and leave quickly. When daylight came, I opened the door and stepped outside. Across the clearing, on the far side where the trees thickened, I noticed something that made my skin prickle. A small branch had been broken and stuck upright in the ground like a marker. It hadn't been there before. Whoever was out there had left it, maybe as a sign, maybe as a message I couldn't understand. I didn't waste more time. I packed food, water, and the hatchet. I locked the cabin even though it wouldn't matter much if someone wanted to break in. I took the narrow dirt trail back toward the gravel road. The whole time, I kept feeling eyes on me. Every snap of a branch made me freeze. I checked behind me often, and twice I thought I saw movement in the trees, a dark shape slipping between trunks. I started moving faster. After an hour, I reached the gravel road. My plan was to follow it the 10 miles back to the highway, then wait for a car to pass. It was a long walk, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between myself and that cabin. Halfway down the gravel road, I looked behind me one last time. In the far distance, at the entrance of the trail I had just come from, a figure stood. Too far to make out details, but tall, still watching. My legs felt like they would give out, but I forced myself to keep walking. I didn't run. I knew if I ran, whoever it was might run too. I kept my pace steady, even though every nerve in me screamed to sprint. It took hours before I finally reached the highway. A truck passed and I waved it down. The driver stopped and let me climb in. I didn't explain much, only said I had been staying in a cabin and wanted to get back to town. He didn't ask questions. When I finally got back home, I couldn't sleep for days. Every sound outside my apartment window made me flinch. I kept thinking about the steps circling in the night, the broken branch stuck upright in the clearing, the figure standing at the end of the trail. Whoever that was, they had chosen to stay hidden in the woods, moving silently, watching. They never spoke, never revealed what they wanted. I never went back to the cabin again. A few months later, I asked my friend if anyone else had stayed there recently. He said no, nobody had used it for years. He didn't know anyone else who even knew the place existed. I still don't know who was out there or why they circled my cabin night after night. What I do know is that they were real, they were close, and they didn't want me there. That is why I left, and that is why I will never go back. I had been looking forward to some quiet time in the cabin for months. The place was small, tucked away at the edge of a dense forest, with nothing but dirt trails leading to it. I had been there a few times before, usually in the warmer months, but this time I wanted to stay later into the season, when the air grew colder and the woods seemed emptier. I thought it would give me a chance to disconnect from everything, to spend my days with nothing but the trees, the sound of wind, and the kind of silence that only exists far from people. I wanted to be completely alone, and I thought I was ready for it. The cabin was old but solid. Its walls were made of rough wood that had gone gray from years of weather, and the roof was patched with metal sheets to keep out leaks. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a stove, a small table, a narrow bed against the wall, and a shelf with some tools and supplies. The floor creaked under my weight, and the smell of old pine boards hung in the air. A single window looked out toward the clearing in front of the cabin, and beyond that, the dark tree line. I had brought enough food, water, and firewood to last several weeks, along with a lantern, extra batteries, and my old rifle for safety. At first, the days passed slowly but peacefully. I would wake with the pale light of morning, stoke the fire, and boil water for coffee. I walked through the woods, collected more firewood, and sometimes sat by the lake that was a short hike from the cabin. The nights were long and cold, but I wrapped myself in blankets and listened to the steady crackle of the fire. I thought I had found exactly what I was looking for. Complete quiet, no interruptions, no one around for miles. It was on the 5th night that I first felt something wasn't right. I had gone to bed early because the wind had picked up outside, making the trees groan and shift. Around midnight, I woke suddenly, unsure of why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was dark except for the faint glow. At first, I thought it was the wind that had woken me, But then I realized I had heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to the woods. It had been faint, like the crunch of a boot on frozen ground. I lay still, holding my breath, listening carefully. The sound came again, just outside the cabin, near the clearing. It was slow and heavy, not like the light scurrying of an animal. I told myself it could have been a deer or maybe a bear, but I couldn't shake the sense that it was footsteps. I reached for the rifle beside the bed, my hands shaking a little as I held it. The sound stopped after a minute, and the silence that followed was even worse. I didn't move until the first hint of daylight came through the window. In the morning, I stepped outside to look around. The ground was damp from the night frost, and I could see clear impressions in the soil just beyond the clearing. They weren't the prints of an animal. They were boots, deep enough to show weight. They circled part of the cabin, then disappeared into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to think of a reason anyone else would be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the dirt trail that led to the cabin wasn't easy to find. No one I knew had any reason to come. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. Every sound from the woods made me look up, and I kept checking the tree line as if someone might step out. I told myself maybe it had been hunters passing through, though it didn't make sense for them to come so close to the cabin. I kept the rifle close, even when I sat by the fire that evening. That night, the footsteps came again. This time they were closer, slower, circling the cabin more deliberately. I sat up in bed, the rifle clutched tight in my hands, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I didn't light the lantern because I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The steps would stop for long stretches, then start again like whoever was out there was waiting, watching. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but it could have been the trees shifting in the wind. When dawn finally came, I went outside again. The prints were back, fresh in the dirt, circling the cabin twice before heading toward the trees. Whoever it was had been out there for hours, close enough to touch the walls if they wanted. I didn't sleep the next night. I sat by the fire with the rifle across my knees, waiting and listening. The footsteps returned, but this time they stayed farther away, just on the edge of the clearing. It was almost worse, because I couldn't see or hear them clearly, only faint movements, the crunch of frozen ground when the wind died. By the seventh night, I was worn down. I couldn't keep my eyes open, but I didn't dare fall fully asleep. I dozed in short bursts, waking at every noise. Around midnight, I heard something new. The soft scrape of wood, like someone brushing a hand or an object against the side of the cabin. My stomach turned cold. I tightened my grip on the rifle and stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing came. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, then faded. I thought about leaving, but the trail back to town was long, and I didn't know if whoever was out there might be waiting. The cabin, small as it was, felt like the only shelter I had. But the feeling of being hunted grew stronger each day. I stopped walking to the lake. I stopped leaving the clearing at all. I rationed my food and kept the lantern dim at night. One afternoon, I went to check the back of the cabin and froze. On the wall, scratched faintly into the wood, were marks. At first, I thought they were just scrapes from branches, but when I looked closer, I saw they had been made deliberately, long vertical lines almost like tallies. There were 6 of them. I didn't touch them. I backed away slowly and went inside, bolting the door. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The sounds came back. Footsteps, scraping, the faint creak of wood as if weight pressed against it. Hours passed like that. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside the window, heavy and steady, but I forced myself not to look. The fear was so strong I could hardly move. By the 10th night, I had reached my breaking point. I couldn't stay any longer. As soon as the sun rose, I packed what I could carry, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The air was cold, the clearing silent, but I felt eyes on me as I walked toward the trail. The tallies on the wall now numbered 7. I moved quickly, not stopping to rest, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest felt wrong, too still, like everything was holding its breath. My nerves were raw, every crack of a branch making me flinch. At one point, I saw movement far behind me, a figure in the trees just for a second before it slipped out of sight. I didn't wait to see more. I pushed myself harder, nearly running at times, until the trail finally widened and I saw the faint outline of the road ahead. When I reached my truck, I threw my things in and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was nothing but a shadow in the rearview mirror. I never returned to the cabin after that. I told myself I wouldn't, no matter how much I missed the silence of the woods. The scratches on the wall, the footsteps circling in the night, the feeling of being watched. I knew if I went back, I might not leave again. The cabin still stands there, I'm sure, weathering in the woods, waiting in the clearing where the trees crowd close. Maybe someone else will stumble on it one day. Maybe they'll see the marks on the wall and wonder about them, the way I first did. Or maybe, if they stay long enough, they won't have to wonder at all. I drove up the long dirt road later in the afternoon, the sky already beginning to dim as the sun slid low behind the tall pine trees. The tires crunched against the gravel and dry leaves, and every bump made the old pickup shake. It had been a long drive from town, and my back was stiff from sitting too long in the seat. The forest looked darker the deeper I went, the branches closing in overhead until the road felt like a tunnel cut through the woods. I had been to this cabin only once before, years ago, when a friend had invited me to spend a few days there. Back then, it had seemed peaceful and quiet, a place to get away from everything. Now, alone, it felt different. There was an uneasy stillness to the air, like the trees were watching me pass through. When I finally saw the small wooden cabin, tucked between the trees at the edge of a slope, I stopped the truck and let out a long breath. It looked the same as I remembered. A square little place, weathered wood, a single porch with a railing that leaned a little to the side. The windows were small, dusty, and I could already see the cobwebs stretched across the corners of the glass. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like a weight pressing against my ears. Out here, there was no hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. I got out of the truck, stretched my legs, and walked to the porch with my bag slung over my shoulder. The steps creaked under my boots. I pulled the old brass key from my pocket, slid it into the lock, and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, stale wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like damp cloth that had been left in a corner too long. I stepped inside, dropped my bag on the floor, and looked around. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, but dirtier. A small table and 2 chairs sat in the corner, the surface covered in dust. An old sofa with a sagging middle leaned against the wall. The fireplace was filled with cold ashes, and above it, the wooden mantel held a few small items left behind years ago. A rusted lantern, a cracked mug, a stack of old mail yellowed with age. I ran my hand across the table, leaving a clear line through the dust, and immediately felt the urge to clean. But I was tired, and I decided it could wait until morning. I pulled back the curtain on the small window and looked outside. The trees stood close together, their trunks black against the fading light. Beyond them, the slope dropped steeply down toward a stream I remembered being there. The water had been loud enough to hear from the porch when everything else was quiet. Right now, though, I didn't hear it. I shut the door, locked it, and walked across the creaking floorboards to check the rest of the cabin. The bedroom was just as small as the rest of the place, with a thin mattress on a wooden frame and a single dresser pushed against the wall. The sheets smelled of mildew, and I made a mental note to use my sleeping bag instead. The bathroom was barely big enough to stand in, with a cracked mirror and a sink that I wasn't sure even worked anymore. After checking everything, I sat down on the sofa, listening to the wood creak under my weight. The quiet was unsettling. In town, even at night, there was always some background noise. Out here, there was nothing, just my breathing, the occasional tick of the old clock on the wall, and the faint groan of the cabin as the wood shifted. As night fell, the cabin grew darker than I expected. The single bulb above the table flickered when I turned it on, and I didn't trust it to last long. I lit a couple of candles I had brought with me, their small flames casting long shadows across the walls. I ate a simple meal from the cooler: bread, cheese, and a little fruit, and washed it down with lukewarm water. Then I sat there, in the dim light, staring at the walls and listening. It wasn't long before I started hearing things outside. At first, it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I heard something heavier, a branch snapping, leaves crunching, the sound of something moving slowly, carefully, just beyond the line of the trees. My chest tightened as I sat there, frozen, straining to hear more. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. There were plenty of animals out here. Still, the sound went on longer than I liked, circling around the side of the cabin, then stopping near the back. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the sound faded away, leaving me in silence again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it hadn't gone far. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would take away the unease. I rolled out my sleeping bag on top of the mattress, climbed in, and lay on my back staring at the ceiling. The cabin groaned every few minutes, the wood shifting as the temperature dropped. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted. I closed my eyes, but my body stayed tense, listening for every sound. It felt like hours before I finally drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had woken me, though I wasn't sure what. My eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the darkness, and I lay perfectly still. The only light came from the thin strip of moonlight slipping through the crack in the curtain. My ears strained for sound, and that's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards just outside the bedroom door. My blood went cold. I stayed frozen in the bed, barely breathing, listening again. Another creak, closer this time. The sound of weight shifting on old wood. My mind raced. I knew I had locked the door when I came in. There was no way someone could have gotten inside without me hearing it. But the sound was real, too real. I sat up slowly, careful not to make the bed creak, and reached for the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The bedroom door was closed, but I thought I saw a shadow move under the crack at the bottom. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The shadow didn't move again. I forced myself to get up, each step on the floor making a small groan. I reached the door, my hand on the knob, and yanked it open with the flashlight aimed ahead. The beam lit up the main room of the cabin, empty and silent. The sofa, the table, the fireplace, all exactly where they had been. No one there, but the front door was unlocked. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the latch. I knew I had locked it. I was certain. I reached out, touched it, and locked it again, my hands shaking. My throat was dry, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard it made my chest ache. The rest of the night was endless. I sat against the wall with the flashlight in my hand, waiting for something else, but nothing came. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, and only then did I let myself relax enough to move. That morning, I walked around the cabin outside, looking for signs of anything. The dirt around the porch was disturbed, pressed down by heavy boots. Not animal tracks, not random. Someone had been there, and they had been inside. I remember the day I decided to spend a week at the cabin. It was late summer, the kind of time when the days are still warm, but the evenings start to cool off enough that you can feel the season slowly leaning toward fall. The cabin belonged to a distant relative of mine who rarely used it, tucked deep in the woods about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. I wanted some time alone, away from my phone, away from people, away from the constant noise of the city. I told myself it would be good for me, a break from everything. I had no idea that the trip would turn into something that would stick with me for the rest of my life. The drive there was long, with most of it winding through country roads that got narrower the deeper I went into the forest. The last stretch was a dirt road, bumpy and lined with tall trees pressing close to the sides. I didn't pass another car once I turned off the main road. It gave me the first real sense of isolation, but at the time I welcomed it. I thought the silence and space would be refreshing. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly as I expected. A small wooden place with a porch, a single chimney, and one side facing out to a wide patch of clearing that eventually disappeared into more trees. The first day was simple. I unloaded the food and supplies I had packed into the cabin, checked the cupboards, and walked around the place to get familiar with it. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a main living space with an old wood stove in the corner. The smell of wood and dust hit me as soon as I stepped inside. It wasn't a bad smell, just the scent of something left alone for too long. I opened the windows to let fresh air in and unpacked everything neatly. By late afternoon, I had everything ready. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the tree line. The woods looked endless, the kind of endless that made you realize just how small you are when you're out there by yourself. At that moment, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. The peace came from the quiet, but the unease came from knowing that nobody else was around. If something happened, there was no quick help. I brushed it off, telling myself that was the point of being here, to be away from everything. The first night was calm. I built a small fire in the wood stove, cooked some simple food, and read until I got tired. The sounds of the woods at night filled the background. Crickets, the occasional rustle of an animal, the wind moving through the trees. I fell asleep easier than I thought I would, considering how new the place felt. The next day, I woke early and decided to go for a walk. There were faint trails leading away from the cabin, probably used years ago by hunters or hikers. I followed one for a while, carrying a small backpack with water and a snack, but not going too far. I didn't want to risk getting lost, so I kept checking the path behind me to make sure I remembered how it looked. After an hour or so, I turned back. When I got to the cabin again, it was just as I left it, quiet and undisturbed. The days went on like that for a bit. I spent time reading, cooking, taking short walks, and sometimes just sitting on the porch doing nothing but listening to the woods. It felt good to disconnect, but the unease never fully went away. The silence was different from what I was used to. It wasn't city silence, where there's always a faint hum of traffic or people in the distance. This silence was heavy, broken only by the unpredictable noises of nature. It was the 4th night when things began to change. I had been outside earlier in the day, walking one of the trails again, when I thought I saw something. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe even a bear, but it was the shape of a person. The figure was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but it was tall, upright, and moving slowly between the trees. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. Out here, miles from anything, I didn't expect to see another person. It was possible, sure, maybe another hiker, maybe a hunter, but the way the figure moved gave me a bad feeling. They weren't walking confidently down a trail. They were weaving in and out of the trees as if they were trying not to be seen. I told myself it was probably nothing. I turned back toward the cabin and tried to act normal, but the feeling stayed with me the rest of the day. When night came, I couldn't shake the image of that figure. I tried to read, but I kept glancing at the windows. The woods outside looked darker than ever. Every sound made me flinch. At some point during the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what woke me. Maybe a noise, maybe just the kind of unease that jerks you awake when your mind knows something isn't right. I lay there in the dark, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the creaks of the cabin. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving across the clearing near the porch. I held my breath. The steps crunched on the dry ground, paused, then moved again. It wasn't the random movement of an animal. It was too steady, too human. My heart pounded as I lay there, trying to decide what to do. I didn't have a gun, only a hatchet I had used for chopping firewood. The cabin doors were locked, but the windows weren't exactly secure. Whoever was out there could get in if they really wanted to. The footsteps circled the cabin. I could hear them move from one side to the other, slow and careful. At one point, they stopped right outside my bedroom wall. I could almost feel the presence of someone standing there, listening, breathing. I stayed as still as I could, every muscle in my body tight. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again, fading slowly into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the hatchet and staring at the bedroom door. When the sun finally came up, I got out of bed and checked outside. The clearing looked normal, but when I walked around the cabin, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal prints. They were boots, large ones, and they circled the cabin exactly as I had heard. That day, I couldn't relax. I checked the locks a dozen times. I tried to keep busy, but everything I did felt pointless because I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone had been out there. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself maybe it was just a hiker who got curious. Maybe someone passing through. Still, I couldn't explain why they would circle the cabin in the middle of the night. That night, I barely slept. I kept the hatchet next to me in bed, listening for any noise outside. For a while, it was quiet, but then the footsteps came again. This time, they came earlier, not in the dead of night, but closer to midnight. They started near the tree line, moving slowly toward the cabin. I could hear the deliberate crunch of boots on dry ground, pausing every few steps, as if the person was watching or listening. My throat went dry. I wanted to look out the window, but I was terrified of what I might see. The steps circled again, slow, steady, patient. At one point, they stopped right on the porch. The wood creaked under the weight of whoever was out there. I stared at the bedroom door, waiting, every nerve in my body on edge. After a long silence, there was a sound that made my stomach drop, the soft rattle of the doorknob being tested. Slowly, carefully, as if the person wanted to see if it was unlocked. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had locked it earlier, double-checked it, but hearing it tested in the dark was worse than anything I could have imagined. The knob rattled once more, then stopped. The silence stretched. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shaky. Then, finally, the steps moved off the porch. I listened until they faded into the woods, though I didn't believe for a second that the person was really gone. Morning felt unreal. The sun was out. The woods looked calm, but I knew what had happened in the dark. I walked around again, and the footprints were there, fresh ones circling the cabin, heavier near the porch. I realized then that whoever it was, they weren't just curious. They were watching me, testing the locks, waiting. I wanted to leave. Every part of me wanted to get in my car and drive away, but fear held me back. The idea of walking outside with bags, loading the car while someone could be watching from the trees, made my skin crawl. I decided to wait until full daylight, maybe even midday, when the woods were as bright as they could be. The hours crawled by. I sat inside with the hatchet, jumping at every sound. When noon came, I started packing. I loaded everything quickly, moving from the cabin to the car in fast, nervous bursts. My eyes kept flicking to the trees, expecting to see someone step out. I didn't, but that didn't calm me. The woods felt alive, watching. When the car was packed, I got in and started it. The sound of the engine breaking the silence felt like a relief. I pulled away from the cabin, driving fast down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel tight. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a figure step out behind me. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally breathed a little easier. I drove all the way back to town without stopping. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said I cut the trip short because it didn't feel right. But the truth is, I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone was out there, circling that cabin, testing the locks, waiting for me to make a mistake. I had been wanting a break from everything for a while, and the chance came when a friend of mine offered me his small hunting cabin deep in the woods. He said he rarely used it anymore and that I could spend as long as I wanted there. I packed my things, filled up my car with supplies, and drove out toward the cabin. It was late autumn, the days short, the nights cold, and the woods already looked stripped bare with most of the leaves on the ground. The drive itself felt long. The paved road turned into gravel, and then after another half hour it narrowed into a dirt road that was just wide enough for my car. The trees grew tight around the road, branches leaning in, their bare tips almost scratching my windshield. I kept driving until I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, made of dark logs, with a slanted roof and a stone chimney. The place looked quiet, almost too quiet. There were no other houses or cabins in sight. No sound of traffic, just the wind moving through the trees and the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel. I parked near the cabin and carried my things inside. The cabin was simple. One room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, some shelves stocked with old canned goods, and a small bathroom that ran off a water tank outside. The windows had shutters, and there was a back door that led out toward the treeline. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. The smell inside was old wood and a faint trace of smoke from past fires. That first day was calm. I unloaded my things, stacked some wood inside for the stove, and got a fire going. The warmth filled the cabin slowly, and I sat at the table eating a simple meal I had brought with me. The quiet was thick, almost heavy. I could hear my own chewing, my own breath, and every shift of the wood as it cracked in the stove. When I stepped outside later to stretch my legs, the cold air hit me hard. The clearing was surrounded by dense trees, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves that crunched under my boots. The sky was already darkening, and I knew I had to get used to the early nights here. That night I slept deeply, the kind of sleep you only get in real silence. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down, and the cabin was cold. The air felt sharp against my face. I sat there for a moment, listening. I thought I had heard something, maybe a crunch outside, maybe the wind. I held my breath and waited. Nothing followed, so I told myself it was just an animal or a branch falling. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next day, I went out into the woods for a walk. I wanted to explore the area, maybe get a sense of the trails around. I carried a small pack with water and a snack, and I made sure to mark my path carefully so I wouldn't get lost. The forest stretched on in every direction, the trees tall and silent, their trunks gray and rough, the forest floor covered in a damp carpet of leaves. It was peaceful but also unsettling. The quiet out here was different than in the cabin. It was open, wide, but at the same time it felt like something could be watching you from any direction. After about an hour of walking, I noticed something strange. Ahead, off the trail, there seemed to be a shape, maybe a tarp or an old tent. Curiosity pulled me closer. When I got near, I saw that it was indeed an old tent, collapsed and weather-beaten, half buried under leaves. The fabric was torn, the poles bent. It looked abandoned for a long time. Around it were bits of trash, rusted cans, a broken lantern, scraps of plastic. It was unsettling, seeing it here so far into the woods. I crouched down and looked closer, but I didn't touch anything. The tent didn't look like it belonged to any hunter or hiker recently. It looked like someone had stayed here, maybe camped here, and then left in a hurry or never came back. The ground around the tent looked disturbed, but it was hard to tell after all this time. I didn't like the feeling it gave me, so I turned and walked back toward the cabin, glancing over my shoulder now and then. That night, after dark settled in, I couldn't shake the thought of that tent. I sat by the fire, listening again to the silence outside. Every now and then, a creak in the woods or a rustle of leaves made me tense up. I kept telling myself it was animals. But later, when I went to bed, I heard something that made my heart race. It was faint, but it was there. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but slower, heavier. They crunched through leaves, then paused. I held my breath, straining my ears. The steps came closer, then stopped again, like whoever or whatever was out there was standing still. I didn't move. My body felt frozen, every nerve alert. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cabin was mostly dark, the faint glow barely lighting the corners. The footsteps started again, this time circling slowly, like someone walking around the clearing. Then silence. I waited for what felt like forever, but I didn't hear them again. I hardly slept the rest of the night. Every sound kept me awake. When daylight came, I stepped outside carefully, scanning the clearing. The ground was covered in leaves, but I could see where some had been disturbed, pressed down, leading from the trees to the side of the cabin and back out again. Someone had been here. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe it was hunters passing through, or someone just wandering the woods. But the cabin was remote, far too remote for random people to be walking around at night. The unease sat heavy in my chest. The next few days, I tried to distract myself. I chopped wood, cooked meals, wrote in a notebook I had brought. But at night, the same thing happened. Footsteps, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. The slow, deliberate pacing around the cabin. One night I swore I heard the back door handle rattle, faint but distinct. My stomach dropped. I blocked the back door with a chair after that. I kept the fire going brighter at night, just for comfort. I even thought about leaving, but the idea of walking out in the dark woods with whoever was out there felt worse than staying put. The final night I spent there was the worst. Started the same, the quiet, the faint steps outside. I sat in bed, clutching a flashlight, waiting. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of wood creaking. Not outside, inside, the floorboard by the door. My chest seized, and my breath went shallow. I knew I had locked the front door. I knew the back door was blocked, but the sound had been clear. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tight, my ears straining. Another creak closer to the stove. My hands shook as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound. For a second, I thought I saw movement, but the light only caught the edge of the table and the glint of metal from the stove handle. I didn't move. I sat frozen until the first light of dawn seeped through the shutters. When morning came, I forced myself up and checked every inch of the cabin. The doors were still locked, the chair still against the back door. But near the window, I saw it. Smudges on the glass, like greasy handprints pressed faintly against it from the outside. My stomach turned. I didn't wait. I packed everything I could into my bags, threw them into the car, and left the cabin behind. The dirt road out felt longer than before, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the main road and kept driving, only then did my chest loosen. I never went back to that cabin. I never told my friend the full truth, just said it wasn't for me. But in my head, I still hear those footsteps circling, still picture those smudged handprints on the glass, proof that I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out there night after night watching me. I had planned the trip to the cabin as a way to escape noise, but the silence ended up being louder than anything I had left behind. The cabin sat deep in the woods, hidden away from roads and power lines, with only a narrow dirt trail leading up to it. The trail was rough, full of rocks and fallen branches, and driving my old car up there had been a fight the entire way. When I finally pulled up to the clearing and killed the engine, the quiet pressed down on me in a way I had not expected. The air felt too still, almost heavy, and the smell of damp earth and pine needles hung everywhere. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered when I first saw it online. It was only a single floor with a short porch and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The wood was dark from age and weather, and green moss had crept up the lower boards where the dampness never seemed to dry. There were no other houses in sight, not even a power line, just walls of tall trees wrapping the clearing in every direction. I had chosen it because of how far away it was from anyone, but the reality of that distance sank in quickly once I was standing there with nothing but trees around me. I carried my bags inside. The air was stale, as if no one had been in there for months. Dust coated the furniture, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. There was only one small bedroom, a kitchen space, and a main sitting area with a fireplace. The windows were narrow and streaked with old dirt, making the daylight dim even though it was only mid-afternoon. I spent the first hour cleaning, opening the windows to let fresh air in, and sweeping away cobwebs from the corners. Every sound I made echoed back too loud, bouncing off the small walls. The silence would close in again after each movement, leaving me standing there listening to my own breath. By evening, I had a fire going in the fireplace. The flames gave the cabin a softer glow, but they also threw shadows across the walls that shifted every time the logs popped. I cooked something simple on the small gas stove and ate at the table, listening to the fire crackle. Outside, the woods had grown dark. There were no streetlights here, no signs of anything human beyond the small glow of my cabin window. When I stepped outside to put some trash away, I noticed how thick the darkness was. My flashlight beam barely reached more than 10 feet before it was swallowed. Beyond that, there was nothing but the sound of branches moving in the wind. That first night, I struggled to sleep. The bed was stiff, the blanket smelled of dust, and every creak of the cabin kept pulling me awake. I would doze off for a few minutes, only to snap awake at some sound. A thump outside, the groan of wood settling, a sharp snap like a stick breaking underfoot. Each time, my heart would start racing, and I would lay there staring into the dark until exhaustion pulled me under again. By morning, the unease had dulled but not left. I made coffee on the stove and stepped out onto the porch. The woods were quiet except for birds somewhere far off. The ground was damp with dew, and the air smelled fresher than it had inside. I told myself I just needed time to adjust. That day, I explored the area around the cabin. The trail that led and twisted far back toward the main road, but there were also faint deer paths weaving through the trees. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and branches, soft to walk on but also noisy with each step. Every time I paused, I would listen hard, but I never heard anything except my own breathing and the wind stirring the treetops. The second night was worse than the first. I had built up a stronger fire, thinking the glow would make me feel safer, but it only made the shadows sharper. I lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds around me. At some point in the night, I heard a noise that made me freeze completely. It was not the groan of wood or the wind against the walls. It was a steady crunching sound, like footsteps moving across leaves. They were slow, not hurried, and they stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath. The fire was still glowing faintly through the cracks in the fireplace, casting orange light across the room. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear the faint shift of weight, like someone standing close. I stayed as still as possible, barely even breathing, waiting. Minutes passed. The sound did not come again. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the porch, but the weight of the steps had sounded too heavy, too deliberate. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside to check. The ground was damp and soft enough to hold impressions, and I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning. On the side near the woods, I found marks in the dirt. They were faint, not clear, but long enough and wide enough that they looked like shoe prints, not animal tracks. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, and then back again. My stomach tightened as I crouched down to look closer. The prints were blurred at the edges, like someone had stepped there when the ground was wet, maybe during the night. I stood there, listening to the still woods, feeling suddenly watched. The rest of that day, I could not relax. I kept looking out the windows, checking the tree line. Each time I thought I saw movement, but when I looked harder, there was nothing. The feeling of being alone was gone. It felt like something unseen was sharing the space around me, waiting at the edges of the clearing. By the third night, I had moved a chair against the front door and kept the hatchet I used for firewood beside my bed. The fire crackled low, but I barely slept. The air in the cabin was thick, heavy with silence. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, steady steps moving from one side to the other. My chest tightened. I gripped the hatchet handle, my palms sweating. The steps paused outside my bedroom wall. I could hear the faint shift of weight, as if someone were leaning close. Then, a sound that made my skin crawl, light scraping against the wood. Not claws, not an animal, but something sharp dragged slowly across the wall. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. The silence afterward was unbearable. I lay awake until dawn, never once closing my eyes. When light finally seeped in through the windows, I rushed outside. On the wall of the cabin, just below the window, was a long mark. A scrape that cut through the old wood, fresh and raw. I knew then it wasn't an animal. Someone had been outside my cabin during the night, close enough to drag something sharp against the wall. The fear grew heavier each day. I stopped exploring the woods and stayed inside, keeping the fire burning and listening to every sound. I thought about leaving, but the trail out was rough, and I told myself maybe it was just some hunter passing through. But the signs kept coming. More prints in the dirt. A shape I glimpsed once between the trees, gone before I could be sure. The feeling of eyes on me whenever I stepped outside. By the fifth night, I knew I could not stay. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the hatchet still in my grip. The steps came again, slower this time, as if whoever it was knew I was listening. They stopped at the porch. I could hear the faint creak of wood as weight pressed down. The door rattled softly as if tested. Then silence. I stayed frozen, heart pounding, waiting for the door to burst open, but it never did. When morning came, I packed everything fast. I barely ate, just stuffed my things into bags and hauled them to the car. The clearing was quiet, too quiet, but I could feel eyes on me from the trees. The prints were there again, fresh, circling the cabin like someone had walked around it during the night, again and again. I started the car and drove down the trail, every bump and turn shaking through me. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind me. But the road stayed empty. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally felt my chest loosen. The woods still pressed close, but I knew I was leaving them behind. I did not stop until I was miles away, the cabin long out of sight. Even now, I can still feel the weight of that silence, the sound of those slow footsteps circling in the dark. Whoever it was never showed themselves fully, never tried to break in while I was there. But they wanted me to know they were there, and they did. That cabin sits empty again now, and I know I will never go back. The woods are wide and endless, and somewhere in them, someone waits for the next person who comes alone. I drove up into the mountains late that afternoon, the air thick and heavy with the smell of damp pine. The road was narrow and winding, the kind of road where you always feel like the edge is just a little too close to your tires. I had rented an old cabin for a week, a place that had been recommended by someone at work who said it was quiet, isolated, and perfect for being alone. That was what I wanted, a break from everything. No neighbors, no constant buzzing of traffic, no cell reception that kept me tied to people. Just me and the woods. The cabin was smaller than I expected when I finally pulled into the clearing. A rough wooden structure, dark brown from years of weather beating against it. The windows were small, almost too small for the size of the rooms I imagined inside. A short chimney stuck out from the roof. Around the cabin, the ground was uneven and scattered with dead branches. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where other vehicles must have parked before. I cut the engine and sat for a while, listening to the sound of nothing. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. A light wind moved the tops of the trees, and every so often I heard the faint creak of wood as the cabin settled. My hand rested on the steering wheel longer than it should have, like part of me didn't want to get out. When I finally did, the smell of damp moss hit me. The air was colder than I expected, sharper. My boots sank into the soft ground as I carried my bags to the porch. The porch was slanted, boards soft under my weight, and I could see where some had been patched with nails that had already started to rust. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing that struck me was how dark it was. The windows hardly let in light. The living area was one room with a fireplace against the far wall, a couch, a table, and 2 wooden chairs. A rug in the center smelled faintly of mildew. A hallway led to the back where the bedroom and bathroom must have been. I set my bags down and went through the place. The bedroom was simple. A bed with a thick, scratchy blanket, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and another small window that looked out into the trees. The bathroom had an old sink and a shower with rust around the drain. Everything felt damp, like the wood of the cabin itself held water from years of rain. When I came back into the living room, I noticed something strange. On the table, there was a deep scratch in the wood. Not like a small mark, but a groove, jagged, almost as if someone had taken a knife and dragged it across the surface over and over. I ran my hand across it and felt the uneven edges. I figured maybe someone had used it for cutting or carving. It didn't mean anything. Still, I thought about it longer than I needed to. I unpacked slowly, putting some food in the old fridge, laying out the clothes I would need. The silence pressed against me in a way I wasn't used to. Even at night in the city, there were always distant cars, neighbors moving around, something. Here, when the fridge clicked off, the silence was heavy, thick. Every sound I made seemed louder than it should have been. That night, I built a small fire in the fireplace. The wood burned slow, crackling, filling the room with the smell of smoke. I sat on the couch and tried to read, but I found myself glancing at the windows more often than at the pages. It was the thought of the forest outside, how close the trees were, how black it must be between them. The window beside the couch gave only a reflection of the room, but when I leaned forward, cupping my hands to block the light, all I saw was black. No shapes, no stars, just a dark wall. I turned in early, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin made me open my eyes. At some point, I heard what I thought was movement outside, like someone stepping on leaves. I held my breath, waiting, listening for it again. It didn't come. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, I went out to walk the property. There wasn't much to it. Behind the cabin, the trees grew thicker, the ground sloping downward. To the east, there was a shallow ravine with a stream running through it. I followed it for a while, the sound of water breaking the silence that had already started to feel heavy again. I saw no one, no cabins, no signs of people, no trails. When I came back, I noticed something near the porch, a small piece of paper, half buried in dirt. I picked it up. It was damp and torn, but I could make out faint pencil writing. Not a full note, just a line or two. The first line said, "Don't stay here at night." The second was too smudged to read. I stood there for a long time, holding the paper, reading it again and again. My first thought was that it was old. Maybe someone left it years ago. The edges of the paper were soft, worn. Maybe it had blown from somewhere else. But the words stayed with me. I carried it inside and set it on the counter, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling building in my stomach. The rest of the day, I kept myself busy, chopping wood from a small pile near the shed, cooking, trying to read. But no matter what I did, my mind went back to that note. At one point, I looked at the scratch on the table again and felt the same unease, like the two things were connected somehow. That night, I built another fire. I tried to sleep earlier, but I woke up around midnight to a sound outside. Not the wind, not the normal creaks of the cabin. A sharper sound, like a branch snapping. I froze, heart pounding, waiting. Then another sound, closer, like a footstep. I sat up in bed, staring at the window. I wanted to move, to look, but I couldn't. My body felt locked. I heard another step, then silence. I waited, listening so hard I thought my ears might ring. Minutes passed. Nothing else came. The next morning, I went outside to look. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed something in the dirt a few feet from the cabin. A print. Not deep, but there. A shoe print. Clear enough to tell it wasn't mine. I spent the rest of that day with my nerves pulled tight. I couldn't focus on anything. Every sound made me look up. The woods no longer felt still. They felt like they were holding something, watching. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the fire burning low, listening. Several times I thought I heard movement outside, but I couldn't be sure. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but it could have been a trick of the firelight. The next morning, I decided I had enough. I packed quickly, ready to leave. But when I went outside, I froze. In the dirt, not far from where I saw the print, was something else. A long mark, like someone had dragged something sharp across the ground. Straight lines, deep, too clean to be natural. I felt my chest tighten. I got into the car and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I lifted the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. Still, I saw it clearly. The wires had been cut. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there. Someone had gone under the hood in the night and made sure I couldn't leave. The rest of the day, I stayed inside, door locked, every window checked twice. I sat with a kitchen knife in my lap, staring at the door, waiting. Hours dragged by. The sun went down. Darkness swallowed the windows. I heard it again that night. Footsteps outside, slow, moving around the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes starting again. At one point, I heard something brush against the wall, a scrape of metal against wood. I sat frozen, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like hours. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light came, I stepped outside. My eyes went to the dirt immediately. More prints, clearer this time, circling the cabin. Someone had walked around and around, close enough to touch the walls. I checked the shed, hoping for tools, for anything. Inside I found an axe, its blade dull but heavy. I carried it back, setting it near the couch. That day I tried the car again. Nothing. The wires were shredded. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. I thought about walking out, following the road, but it was miles to anywhere, and I didn't know if whoever was out there was waiting in the woods. By nightfall, I felt like the cabin was shrinking around me. The air felt tight. When darkness came, I built the fire higher than before, but I couldn't stop glancing at the windows. The noises came again, this time sharper. At one point, the doorknob rattled, slowly but enough to hear. I stood frozen, staring at it. Stopped, then silence again. Hours passed like that. My heart never slowed. My grip never loosened. When light came again, I was still awake, still holding the knife. The third day, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I stuffed food and water into a backpack, grabbed the axe, and left on foot. The woods felt endless, the trees pressing in from all sides. Every sound made me stop and turn. I followed the road, keeping my eyes moving. The silence was thicker than before, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I walked for what felt like hours before I saw movement behind me, a shape between the trees. I drove up into the mountains late that afternoon, the air thick and heavy with the smell of damp pine. The road was narrow and winding, the kind of road where you always feel like the edge is just a little too close to your tires. I had rented an old cabin for a week, a place that had been recommended by someone at work who said it was quiet, isolated, and perfect for being alone. That was what I wanted, a break from everything. No neighbors, no constant buzzing of traffic, no cell reception that kept me tied to people. Just me and the woods. The cabin was smaller than I expected when I finally pulled into the clearing. A rough wooden structure, dark brown from years of weather beating against it. The windows were small, almost too small for the size of the rooms I imagined inside. A short chimney stuck out from the roof. Around the cabin, the ground was uneven and scattered with dead branches. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where other vehicles must have parked before. I cut the engine and sat for a while, listening to the sound of nothing. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. A light wind moved the tops of the trees, and every so often I heard the faint creak of wood as the cabin settled. My hand rested on the steering wheel longer than it should have, like part of me didn't want to get out. When I finally did, the smell of damp moss hit me. The air was colder than I expected, sharper. My boots sank into the soft ground as I carried my bags to the porch. The porch was slanted, boards soft under my weight, and I could see where some had been patched with nails that had already started to rust. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing that struck me was how dark it was. The windows hardly let in light. The living area was one room with a fireplace against the far wall, a couch, a table, and 2 wooden chairs. A rug in the center smelled faintly of mildew. A hallway led to the back where the bedroom and bathroom must have been. I set my bags down and went through the place. The bedroom was simple. A bed with a thick, scratchy blanket, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and another small window that looked out into the trees. The bathroom had an old sink and a shower with rust around the drain. Everything felt damp, like the wood of the cabin itself held water from years of rain. When I came back into the living room, I noticed something strange. On the table, there was a deep scratch in the wood. Not like a small mark, but a groove, jagged, almost as if someone had taken a knife and dragged it across the surface over and over. I ran my hand across it and felt the uneven edges. I figured maybe someone had used it for cutting or carving. It didn't mean anything. Still, I thought about it longer than I needed to. I unpacked slowly, putting some food in the old fridge, laying out the clothes I would need. The silence pressed against me in a way I wasn't used to. Even at night in the city, there were always distant cars, neighbors moving around, something. Here, when the fridge clicked off, the silence was heavy, thick. Every sound I made seemed louder than it should have been. That night, I built a small fire in the fireplace. The wood burned slow, crackling, filling the room with the smell of smoke. I sat on the couch and tried to read, but I found myself glancing at the windows more often than at the pages. It was the thought of the forest outside, how close the trees were, how black it must be between them. The window beside the couch gave only a reflection of the room, but when I leaned forward, cupping my hands to block the light, all I saw was black. No shapes, no stars, just a dark wall. I turned in early, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin made me open my eyes. At some point, I heard what I thought was movement outside, like someone stepping on leaves. I held my breath, waiting, listening for it again. It didn't come. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, I went out to walk the property. There wasn't much to it. Behind the cabin, the trees grew thicker, the ground sloping downward. To the east, there was a shallow ravine with a stream running through it. I followed it for a while, the sound of water breaking the silence that had already started to feel heavy again. I saw no one, no cabins, no signs of people, no trails. When I came back, I noticed something near the porch, a small piece of paper, half buried in dirt. I picked it up. It was damp and torn, but I could make out faint pencil writing. Not a full note, just a line or two. The first line said, "Don't stay here at night." The second was too smudged to read. I stood there for a long time, holding the paper, reading it again and again. My first thought was that it was old. Maybe someone left it years ago. The edges of the paper were soft, worn. Maybe it had blown from somewhere else. But the words stayed with me. I carried it inside and set it on the counter, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling building in my stomach. The rest of the day, I kept myself busy, chopping wood from a small pile near the shed, cooking, trying to read. But no matter what I did, my mind went back to that note. At one point, I looked at the scratch on the table again and felt the same unease, like the two things were connected somehow. That night, I built another fire. I tried to sleep earlier, but I woke up around midnight to a sound outside. Not the wind, not the normal creaks of the cabin. A sharper sound, like a branch snapping. I froze, heart pounding, waiting. Then another sound, closer, like a footstep. I sat up in bed, staring at the window. I wanted to move, to look, but I couldn't. My body felt locked. I heard another step, then silence. I waited, listening so hard I thought my ears might ring. Minutes passed. Nothing else came. The next morning, I went outside to look. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed something in the dirt a few feet from the cabin. A print, not deep but there. A shoe print, clear enough to tell it wasn't mine. I spent the rest of that day with my nerves pulled tight. I couldn't focus on anything. Every sound made me look up. The woods no longer felt still. They felt like they were holding something, watching. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the fire burning low, listening. Several times I thought I heard movement outside, but I couldn't be sure. At one point I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but it could have been a trick of the firelight. The next morning I decided I had enough. I packed quickly, ready to leave. But when I went outside, I froze. In the dirt, not far from where I saw the print, was something else. A long mark, like someone had dragged something sharp across the ground. Straight lines, deep, too clean to be natural. I felt my chest tighten. I got into the car and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I lifted the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. Still, I saw it clearly. The wires had been cut. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there. Someone had gone under the hood in the night and made sure I couldn't leave. The rest of the day I stayed inside, door locked, every window checked twice. I sat with a kitchen knife in my lap, staring at the door, waiting. Hours dragged by. The sun went down. Darkness swallowed the windows. I heard it again that night. Footsteps outside, slow, moving around the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes starting again. At one point, I heard something brush against the wall, a scrape of metal against wood. I sat frozen, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like hours. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light came, I stepped outside. My eyes went to the dirt immediately. More prints, clearer this time, circling the cabin. Someone had walked around and around, close enough to touch the walls. I checked the shed, hoping for tools, for anything. Inside I found an axe, its blade dull but heavy. I carried it back, setting it near the couch. That day I tried the car again. Nothing. The wires were shredded. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. I thought about walking out, following the road, but it was miles to anywhere, and I didn't know if whoever was out there was waiting in the woods. By nightfall, I felt like the cabin was shrinking around me. The air felt tight. When darkness came, I built the fire higher than before, but I couldn't stop glancing at the windows. The noises came again, this time sharper. At one point, the doorknob rattled, slowly but enough to hear. I stood frozen, staring at it. Stopped, then silence again. Hours passed like that. My heart never slowed. My grip never loosened. When light came again, I was still awake, still holding the knife. The third day, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I stuffed food and water into a backpack, grabbed the axe, and left on foot. The woods felt endless, the trees pressing in from all sides. Every sound made me stop and turn. I followed the road, keeping my eyes moving. The silence was thicker than before, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I walked for what felt like hours before I saw movement behind me, a shape between the trees. I had been driving for hours before I finally reached the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. The road was barely visible, just a thin path carved between thick trees and brush, and it looked like no one had driven down it for a very long time. My tires bounced and slid on the uneven ground, and every few yards I worried I would bottom out or get stuck in the mud. The trees pressed in on both sides, branches scraping the sides of my car, and I had to inch forward slowly to keep from damaging the vehicle. The cabin itself was a small wooden structure tucked deep into the forest. The paint had long faded from the walls, leaving only raw gray wood exposed to years of weather. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the single chimney had black streaks running down its bricks from smoke and rain. A rickety porch wrapped around the front with steps that creaked the second I set my weight on them. I had rented the place online, advertised as a secluded getaway, the kind of retreat where you could forget the world for a few days and sit with nothing but the sound of nature. It was early evening when I arrived, and the forest was beginning to darken. The cabin sat in a clearing, the ground uneven and covered with moss, pine needles, and scattered branches. To one side, there was a small shed with a padlock on it, its wood even more weathered than the cabin. I had been given one key for the main door, nothing else. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room combined the kitchen and living area, with an old wood stove against one wall, a small counter with a sink, and a table with 2 chairs. The floorboards were rough and groaned beneath my boots. A short hallway led to a bathroom with an ancient toilet and a bedroom at the end, furnished with only a bed, a dresser, and a narrow window looking into the trees. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke, but it wasn't unbearable. There was no electricity. I had been told that in advance. The only light came from candles left on the shelves and an oil lamp beside the bed. The water supply was from a hand pump outside, and firewood was stacked in a pile near the porch. It wasn't a luxury place, not even close, but I hadn't been looking for luxury. I had wanted silence, to be away from people and noise, to shut out the constant strain of work and city life. That first night, I unpacked slowly, trying to make the place feel a little less empty. I placed my bag in the bedroom and set up a few things on the dresser. I filled the lamp with oil and lit it, casting a dull yellow glow across the room. Then I stepped outside to pump water into a metal bucket. The pump handle squealed with each pull, and the water came out cold and metallic. When night finally fell, it did so quickly. The trees were so thick that the little light left from the sky disappeared almost instantly. The forest around me became an endless wall of darkness. I lit a few candles in the main room, boiled water on the stove, and ate a simple meal. The sound of the boiling water was the only thing breaking the silence, and even that faded once I poured it away. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. In the city, there was always something in the background. Distant cars, voices, sirens, even at night. Out here, the only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin itself, the rustle of branches, and sometimes, something moving in the leaves far out in the trees. I tried to tell myself it was deer or raccoons, but the truth was I couldn't tell. I went to bed early, listening to the wind pushing against the cabin walls. I thought sleep would come fast after such a long day, but I kept waking up at every small sound. Once, in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, the boards whining under each step. I froze, my heart pounding. I reached for the lamp, but then the steps stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting to hear them again, but they never came. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Oldwood shifted and groaned all the time, and my mind had probably turned those sounds into something they weren't. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There were prints in the dirt near the porch. Not animal tracks, shoes. The prints were faint, smudged into the soft ground, but they were there. Someone had been standing near the steps during the night. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared quickly into the grass and leaves. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tree line, trying to see if anyone was watching. Nothing moved. The forest looked still, ordinary, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing in the dark, just out of sight, waiting. I told myself it could have been an old track. Maybe someone else had stayed here recently and left them. I tried to focus on something else, so I went for a walk along the path that led away from the cabin. It wound through the trees for miles, eventually leading down toward a small lake. The water was still and glassy, reflecting the gray clouds above. I sat there for a while, trying to relax, but the entire time I felt uneasy, like someone was standing behind me. That night was worse. The wind had picked up, and the trees knocked against each other, filling the air with sharp cracks and groans. I lit the oil lamp in the bedroom and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every time I started to relax, I heard something outside. Once it was the sound of branches breaking. Another time, it was what sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. They would start on one side, move slowly around to the back, then stop. Then, after a long pause, they would start again. I didn't move. I sat on the bed, gripping the lamp, listening. At one point, I thought I heard the sound of breathing just outside the thin wall. Slow, steady breathing, like someone pressed their face close to the wood. The sound eventually faded, and I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to return. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, the prints were back. Clearer this time. They led around the cabin in a wide circle, then stopped near the bedroom window. I felt a rush of panic, and I knew then it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there during the night, standing just feet from where I had been lying. I checked the shed, but the padlock was still in place. I searched the woods as far as I could, but there was no sign of anyone. The following day dragged on forever. I couldn't relax, couldn't stop looking out the windows. The silence that I had once thought would be peaceful now felt suffocating. Every gust of wind made me jump. Every sound of leaves moving made me tense. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was far, and I had told no one exactly when I'd return. I had planned for days out here, and part of me kept thinking I was overreacting. That night, I barely blew out the lamp before I heard it again. The steps on the porch, this time slower than before. Then the sound of the door handle rattling. The knob turned, but the lock held. My throat went dry, and I sat upright in bed, staring at the door through the hallway. The rattling stopped. Silence filled the cabin. Then, faintly, from outside, I heard the sound of someone whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. I stayed up until the first light crept into the sky. When I stepped outside, there were marks on the door where someone had tried to force it. Scratches along the wood, fresh and raw. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed what I could as quickly as possible, stuffing everything into my bag. The prince led away into the forest, vanishing among the trees. My car sat at the edge of the clearing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder as I made my way to it, certain I would see someone step out from the woods at any second. When I finally pulled onto the dirt road, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. I drove faster than I should have, tires slipping in the mud, branches scraping the sides. I didn't slow until I saw pavement again, miles away, and only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the people who rented it to me. I don't know who was out there, watching me night after night, circling the cabin, trying the doors. I don't know what they wanted, and I never will. But I know this: if I hadn't left when I did, if I had stayed even one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I drove up into the mountains late in the afternoon, the sun already sitting low behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the narrow gravel road. My hands felt tight around the steering wheel from the constant winding turns and the rough surface that kept jolting the car. The cabin I had rented for the week was farther than I thought, tucked away deeper into the forest than the listing online made it seem. There were no other cars, no houses, not even a power line in sight, just miles of dark trees pressing in on both sides of the road. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I had left the normal world behind. When I finally pulled into the clearing, I shut off the engine and sat there for a minute. The cabin looked small and old, made of weathered logs with a tin roof that looked like it had seen many winters. It wasn't painted or decorated in any way, just a plain wooden box sitting in the middle of a rough patch of grass and dirt. I noticed the forest came right up to the edge of the clearing, the tree line thick and close, almost too close. It gave me the feeling that the trees were leaning toward the cabin, ready to swallow it whole if they grew another foot. The place was quiet in a way that didn't feel normal. Not peaceful quiet, but heavy, pressing quiet. No birds calling, no wind moving the leaves, nothing. Just the faint ticking of the car engine as it cooled. I tried to tell myself that it was just because I wasn't used to being this far out. I unloaded my bags quickly, not liking how exposed I felt in the open space. The inside of the cabin smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened for months. Dust floated in the air, and the wooden floor creaked under my steps. There was only one room with a small kitchen area, a bed against the far wall, and a table with 2 chairs. A single window looked out toward the clearing. There was also a door in the back that I guessed led to a small bathroom. I set my bag down on the bed and looked around. Everything felt a little too simple, like no one had bothered to make the place feel welcoming. But that was fine. I had come out here to be alone, to get away from everything for a week. By the time I finished unpacking, the sun was gone. The forest outside was already dark. I boiled some water on the little gas stove, made instant noodles, and sat by the window while I ate. The glass was streaked with dirt, and I couldn't see much outside except the faint outline of the trees. I kept looking, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but the dark was too thick. After a while, I shut the curtain. I didn't like staring into black nothingness. That night, lying on the bed, I heard the first sound. It was faint, like a branch snapping out in the woods. I froze and listened, my heart beating hard in the silence. Then nothing, just silence again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. The forest was full of life. Of course there would be noises, but I couldn't shake the way it had sounded. Sharp, deliberate, too heavy for something small. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but it was shallow, restless. Every creak of the cabin made me jolt awake. The wind had picked up during the night, brushing against the walls, and in my half-sleep I thought I heard faint footsteps on the porch. When morning finally came, I felt more tired than when I had gone to bed. The next day, I walked the area around the cabin to get my bearings. The clearing wasn't big, maybe 30 feet across, and then it was thick forest in every direction. I followed a narrow trail that led downhill, winding between tall pines and dead branches. The forest floor was soft with layers of old leaves and moss, so quiet that every step I took felt too loud. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile, before I turned back. The deeper I went, the more I felt like the trees were closing in behind me, as if I was stepping into a place I wasn't supposed to be. When I came back into the clearing, something caught my eye. In the dirt near the cabin, just a few feet from the front steps, there were footprints. Not mine. These were larger, heavier, pressed deep into the soft ground. They came out of the trees and stopped near the porch. I crouched down and looked closer. The prints were clear, and they hadn't been there yesterday. My chest tightened as I realized someone had walked up to the cabin during the night. I stood up and looked around the clearing, scanning the trees, but everything was still. The forest looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went inside and locked the door, even though the lock was just a small latch that wouldn't do much against someone determined. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside, trying to read, trying to write, but I kept glancing at the window, waiting for movement. The silence outside pressed harder and harder until I couldn't stand it anymore. That night, I stayed awake in bed, listening. The darkness outside felt alive. Around midnight, I heard it again. A crunch of footsteps in the clearing. Slow, deliberate circling. My throat went dry, and I barely breathed. The sound came closer until it was right outside the cabin. Then came the faint creak of the wooden steps. One slow weight pressing down, then another. Whoever it was stopped right outside the door. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight. The latch on the door rattled softly, like a finger testing it. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. Couldn't move. After what felt like hours, I heard the steps retreat, back across the porch, back into the clearing, and then fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. When the gray light of dawn finally came, I opened the door and stepped outside. The dirt was torn with fresh footprints, leading straight from the forest to my door and back again. They weren't animal prints. They were from boots, large boots. My hands shook as I followed them with my eyes into the tree line. Whoever had come wasn't wandering. They had walked straight out of the woods, straight to my door, and then left. The rest of the week blurred into a tense haze. I barely ate. I barely moved from inside the cabin. Every night, the sounds returned. Footsteps in the clearing, circling, sometimes stopping at the window, sometimes pressing onto the porch. I would hear breathing outside, heavy and close, so close it felt like it was right against the thin wall beside my bed. The latch rattled more than once, harder each time. I sat clutching a kitchen knife in my hand, my eyes wide open in the dark, waiting for the door to break. But it never did. By the sixth night, I was unraveling. My body ached from exhaustion. My mind frayed from waiting for the next sound. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The cabin felt like a trap, too small, too fragile. Whoever was out there was watching, waiting, and sooner or later they were going to come inside. At first light, I packed my bag with shaking hands, threw it in the car, and started down the gravel road. My eyes darted to the mirrors, watching the tree line on both sides. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every bend felt like an ambush. When I finally hit the paved road and saw the first sign of a town miles later, the tightness in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't contact the owner. I didn't want to know who had been out there or why they hadn't forced their way in. The footprints, the rattling latch, the slow footsteps circling night after night, those were enough. The scariest part wasn't that someone had come to my cabin in the middle of nowhere. The scariest part was that they didn't just come once. They came every night, testing, waiting, learning how long I would last before I broke. I had not planned to stay in that cabin alone, at least not for more than a few nights, but life had a way of shifting plans without asking. The cabin sat at the edge of a long gravel road, tucked in the trees with no other houses nearby. It belonged to an old friend who told me I could use it whenever I wanted. I needed a break from people, from the noise of town, and from the pressure of my job. I thought a few weeks alone might help me reset my mind. The cabin itself was simple. 2 small rooms, one for sleeping and one for everything else. A wood stove sat near the wall, and a small kitchen counter with a sink that worked if the pump outside was primed right. The bathroom was nothing more than an outhouse 20 steps behind the cabin. The windows were small, single-paned, and the doors were plain wood, old but heavy. When I first arrived, I felt the relief of silence sink in. No cars, no phones, no one around. Only the sound of the wind through the trees and the steady rhythm of my boots on the porch. The first few days were uneventful. I chopped wood, stacked it by the wall, and carried buckets of water from the pump. I cooked simple meals, mostly beans, rice, and some canned soup. At night, I sat near the wood stove, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. The silence of the forest was not empty. It was filled with small sounds, but they were natural. Owls hooted, branches cracked as deer moved through, and sometimes I could hear a stream trickling not far away. Everything felt calm, but on the 4th night, things began to feel different. I had gone to bed early, the cabin dark except for the faint orange glow from the last of the fire. The air outside had turned cold, and frost was already forming on the edges of the window glass. I pulled the blanket up and let my body relax into the wooden bed frame. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly, not sure why. It was silent, too silent. The forest usually had some sound even at night, but this time I couldn't hear anything at all. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. That was when I heard the faint crunch of gravel outside. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but the sound was too steady, too heavy. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. The gravel road led right up to the porch, and I could hear the sound moving closer. My chest tightened, and I felt heat rush into my face even as my body stayed cold. I stayed in bed, staring into the dark, waiting. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't tell if whoever it was had stepped onto the porch or not, but the silence that followed felt heavy. After a long moment, I heard a slow creak, the sound of the wooden porch boards shifting under weight. My throat tightened, and I felt my body go stiff. I wanted to move, to grab something, but I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. It wasn't loud, just a soft twist, like someone checking if it was locked. I had locked it earlier, I was sure of that, but the sound of the knob turning was enough to send a cold wave of panic through me. The knob rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. I lay in the dark, staring toward the front door though I couldn't see it. After a few minutes, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away, slow and steady until they faded into the distance. I did not sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in bed, staring into the dark, waiting for the sound to return. My mind ran in circles, trying to explain it. Maybe it was someone lost, maybe a hunter passing through, maybe just a drunk who found the cabin by accident. But the way they tried the door stuck with me. Whoever it was had wanted to come inside. The next morning, I walked outside carefully, scanning the gravel road and the porch. The ground was frosty, and in the thin layer of frost I could see them. Footprints. They were boots larger than mine, leading from the road up onto the porch. They stopped at the door, then turned and walked back the way they came. I followed them down the road until the frost melted into the dirt. I could not tell which way the person had gone after that. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone thought the cabin was abandoned. Still, I kept my axe close by that day, carrying it even when I went to the pump for water. I stacked more wood, kept myself busy, but I could not stop looking down the road. Every time a breeze moved through the trees, I felt myself flinch. That night, I didn't let the fire die. I kept it burning, letting the light flicker across the walls. I sat in the chair by the stove, the axe leaning against my leg. Hours passed, and I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of gravel. I held my breath, listening, every muscle tense. The sound came closer, slow and steady, until it stopped again near the porch. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo off the walls. For a long time, nothing happened. Then came the creak of the porch boards again. I gripped the axe tighter, sweat starting to form on my palms even though the air was cold. The doorknob rattled, harder than before, followed by a low thud against the door, as if someone pushed their shoulder into it lightly. The wood groaned but held. Another push, harder this time, then silence again. I stared at the door, the flickering firelight casting shadows across it. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away again, fading slowly until I couldn't hear them. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the axe, waiting. The fire burned low, but I didn't dare let it go out completely. My mind kept running through what would happen if the door gave way. In the morning, I checked again. The same footprints in the frost, but this time the frost had been disturbed all around the porch, as if the person had stood there for a long time, moving back and forth. My stomach turned cold when I saw the marks on the door. Small chips in the wood near the lock, like someone had tried to pry it. That day, I decided I couldn't stay passive. I reinforced the door as best I could, sliding a heavy chair against it and wedging pieces of firewood under the handle. I kept the axe by my side, and I even brought the hunting rifle from the corner, though I wasn't sure I could use it if it came to that. I checked every window, making sure they were latched, though I knew the thin glass wouldn't hold if someone wanted to break it. When night came, I felt the weight of dread settle heavy on me. I knew he would come back. It wasn't just chance. Whoever it was knew I was there and they wanted inside. The hours dragged by, every sound outside making my pulse spike. Finally, the now familiar crunch of gravel came again. This time, the footsteps were faster. They came up the road quickly, heavy and direct, no hesitation. The porch groaned under sudden weight, and then the door shook hard as a shoulder slammed into it. The chair jumped, the wood under the handle creaked. I gripped the axe with both hands, my body trembling so badly I thought my knees might give. The pounding continued, heavy blows against the door, over and over. The wood groaned, dust shaking loose from the frame. I could hear the lock straining. My chest tightened so much I could barely breathe. I thought the door would splinter any second, but then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, axe raised, sweat dripping down my back. Then I heard the footsteps move quickly off the porch, back down the gravel road, fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn, unable to move from the spot. When the sun rose, I checked the door again. The wood was split near the lock, the frame cracked from the pounding. One more night like that and it wouldn't hold. The realization sank in heavy and cold. I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing food, water, and my essentials into a bag. I kept the axe in my hand the whole time. The cabin that had once felt peaceful now felt like a trap. Every window seemed like a weak point, every shadow like a threat. By mid-morning, I locked the broken door behind me and started down the gravel road with my pack on and axe in hand. The forest was quiet, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. The walkout felt longer than the drive-in. Every sound of crunching leaves made me spin around. My legs felt heavy, but I didn't stop until I reached the main road where my truck was parked. Only when I was inside with the doors locked did I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend the door had been damaged, but I never explained why. I didn't want to relive it. The silence of the forest had been broken for me. The idea of being out there alone, cut off, with someone watching and waiting outside in the dark. It was enough. I didn't need another night like that. The cabin had once been a place of quiet. It had turned into something else, something I would never forget. And I knew one thing for certain. Whoever that was, they would have come inside if the door had given way. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, when the sun was sinking low over the tree line and the light was beginning to soften into a heavy orange glow. The cabin was small, with weathered wood that looked darker near the bottom from years of rain splashing against it. The roof was metal, dull and rusted in places, and the windows were simple, single panes with no curtains. The cabin sat in a clearing that was surrounded by thick forest on all sides, the kind of forest that grew so tight together it felt like a solid wall of trees when you looked at it. The dirt road I had taken to get there ended about 50 yards behind me, where it disappeared into the trees again. The air was still, heavy with the smell of pine and damp soil. The sound of insects had started up, and there were faint rustles in the brush when small animals moved. I had rented the place for a few days just to get away and clear my head. I wanted quiet, no phone, no traffic, no people. Just me and the woods. The cabin had no electricity, just a wood stove for heat, an old lantern for light, and a pump outside for water. It was exactly what I thought I needed. Inside, the cabin was one single room. There was a bed with a thin mattress pushed against the back wall, a table with 2 chairs near the window, and the stove in the corner with a small pile of chopped wood stacked beside it. The floorboards were uneven and creaked under my boots. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood smoke, dust, and something like damp cloth. It wasn't dirty, but it felt like nobody had lived in it for a long time. I unpacked what little I had brought. A sleeping bag, some canned food, a hunting knife, and a flashlight. I put the cans on the table and laid the sleeping bag across the mattress. I pulled the lantern to the edge of the table and checked that it still had fuel. It did. The silence was thick, only broken by the faint tapping of insects against the outside walls and the occasional sigh of the wind through the trees. As the sun went down, the shadows inside the cabin stretched long. I lit the lantern, its dim yellow glow barely reaching the far corners of the room. I made a small fire in the stove and listened to the crackle as the wood caught. The sound was comforting at first, but once it settled into steady popping and hissing, it only made the silence outside feel heavier. I ate quickly, beans straight out of a can, and then sat at the table staring out the window. The glass reflected the lantern's glow, but beyond that reflection was a wall of black. The forest was gone from sight, swallowed completely by night. I couldn't see the clearing, couldn't see the road, couldn't see anything past the thin reflection of my own face in the window. I realized then how isolated I really was. No lights from a town, no sound of cars, no distant houses. Just me and the woods. The night grew colder, so I fed more wood into the stove and pulled my jacket tight around me. I blew out the lantern and let the firelight flicker across the walls. I thought about how quiet it was, how I couldn't even hear crickets now, and I wondered if I would be able to sleep in that silence. Eventually, I lay down on the mattress with my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin. The fire burned low, and shadows crawled across the ceiling as the last of the flames flickered. I don't know how long I slept before I woke. What woke me wasn't a dream or the cold. It was a sound, a crunch, like a boot pressing down on dry leaves outside the cabin. At first I thought I imagined it. I held still, breathing shallow, my ears straining. Then I heard it again, slow, deliberate, something moving just beyond the wall. I froze completely, every muscle tight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would shake the bed. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer maybe, or something rooting around in the brush. But it didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound quick or clumsy. It sounded heavy, careful, like steps. I stayed there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. The sound circled slowly around the cabin, crunching over leaves and snapping small twigs. Each step was spaced apart, almost cautious. Then it stopped. The silence pressed in again, thicker than before. I thought about lighting the lantern, but then I thought whoever or whatever was outside would see the light. So I stayed still in the darkness, clutching the edge of my sleeping bag. My knife was across the room on the table, too far to reach without crossing open space. Then I heard the sound again, not from the ground this time, from the wall, a soft scrape like fingertips dragging across wood. It moved slowly along the outside of the cabin, sliding from one side to the other. My mouth went dry, my chest felt tight. I didn't move. The scrape stopped, then silence again. I waited what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, moving as quietly as I could. I slid out of the sleeping bag, my feet finding the cold floorboards. The fire had died completely, and the cabin was black. My hands fumbled for the flashlight, but I hesitated to switch it on. I crept toward the table, each board creaking faintly beneath my weight. I reached the knife and wrapped my hand around it, the cold metal steadying me a little. I stayed crouched there, staring toward the door and the windows, waiting for another sound. Then I saw it. A shadow, not inside the cabin, outside. The faintest outline of movement across the window where the blackness was not uniform anymore. Something was standing close enough to block a portion of the night. I could just make out the shape of a head and shoulders. I didn't breathe. The shadow lingered, unmoving, as though whoever was out there was watching the cabin as silently as I was watching them. Then, as slowly as it appeared, it shifted back into the dark until it was gone. I stood there in the silence for what felt like forever, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I just waited. Hours passed. My legs hurt from crouching, my back stiff from staying so still, but I didn't dare lie down again. Finally, the first gray light of dawn started to creep through the windows. When I could see the outlines of the cabin clearly, I stepped to the door and opened it a crack. The clearing was empty. The dirt and grass outside looked untouched. No footprints that I could see. The trees stood still and silent, as if the night before had never happened. I stepped outside slowly, knife still in hand, and looked around. My breath smoked in the cold air. The forest was heavy with mist, curling between the trunks. The world was quiet, but it felt wrong, like something was still out there, hiding just beyond sight. I thought about leaving, packing up and walking back down the dirt road, away from this place. But the road was miles long before it reached anything, and I wasn't sure I wanted to walk it alone, knowing that something or someone had circled my cabin in the night. Instead, I stayed, and as the sun rose higher, the fear didn't fade. It deepened, because I realized something as I looked around that clearing, as I studied the dirt near the cabin walls, the tree line, and the pump near the side. I had been right. There were footprints, but they weren't leading toward the cabin. They were leading away, and they came from under the cabin itself. I had not planned on staying in the cabin for so long, but when the chance came up, I took it. A friend of mine had access to an old family cabin deep in the woods, and he offered to let me use it for a week to get away from everything. I thought it would be a perfect way to clear my head, escape from the constant noise of town, and spend some time in peace. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. The cabin was old, simple, and far from the nearest road. I had to drive along a dirt trail for nearly an hour and then hike another 20 minutes through the trees before I reached it. When I first arrived, I noticed how silent the forest felt. No traffic, no people, only the sound of wind moving through the tall trees and the occasional bird calling from above. The cabin itself was small, made of dark wood that had aged from years of weather, with a slanted roof and a small porch in front. Inside there were only 2 rooms, a main space with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a back room with a narrow bed. The place smelled of old wood and dust, but it felt solid, like it had stood there for decades. I had packed supplies for a week: canned food, dry snacks, a water container, a flashlight, matches, a small hatchet, and some extra clothes. I also had a hunting knife, not because I planned to hunt, but because being out there alone made me feel like I should carry something for safety. I set everything neatly inside, checked the locks on the doors and the one small window, and started to settle in. The first day passed quietly. I hiked a little, chopped some small wood for the stove, and sat on the porch watching the forest. The silence was heavy but calming. When night came, I lit a few candles, heated some food, and lay on the bed reading from a book I had brought. I fell asleep with the sound of wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin's old frame. The second day was much the same, except I wandered farther from the cabin during my walk. I noticed deer tracks in the dirt and once thought I heard something moving through the brush nearby, but when I looked, nothing was there. It made me more aware of how alone I was. Out there, every sound carried, and sometimes I could not tell if it was just the forest shifting or if something was moving around me. By the third night, the peaceful silence of the woods started to feel different. It no longer felt calming but heavy, almost pressing in on me. The forest grew darker earlier than I expected, and the shadows around the cabin seemed thicker. As I sat by the small stove, I thought I heard faint crunches outside, like footsteps on dry leaves. At first, I tried to dismiss it as an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the sound seemed steady, as if something was circling slowly. I blew out the candles and sat still, listening. For a long time, I could hear nothing except my own heartbeat and the faint crackle of the stove fire. Then I heard another crunch, closer this time, near the side of the cabin. My throat went dry, and I gripped the handle of my knife. I knew no one was supposed to be out here. The cabin was too far from the road, too deep in the woods for someone to just wander past. I did not move for hours, sitting frozen in the dark until exhaustion took over and I finally slept, though it was shallow and restless. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground around the cabin was covered in fallen leaves, and I noticed disturbed spots, like something had been pressed down by weight. They were not as clear as footprints, but they did not look natural. I told myself it could have been a deer or maybe a bear, but deep down, I knew they looked more like someone had walked there. That day, I kept closer to the cabin, cutting wood and checking my supplies. I kept the knife on me at all times and stayed alert. As night fell, I felt unease settling heavier in my stomach. I closed the door, locked it, and placed a chair against it, though I doubted the flimsy lock or chair would do much if someone really wanted to come inside. The night dragged on painfully slow. I heard sounds again, faint but steady, like deliberate steps outside in the leaves. Sometimes I thought I heard them stop right outside the wall, so close I imagined someone standing inches away from me, listening. I could not see through the walls and the window was covered, but I knew something was out there. The sounds lasted for hours before fading into silence near dawn. By the fifth day, I was running low on sleep. My hands shook from exhaustion and nerves. Every little noise set me on edge. I barely ate and kept checking the doors and window. During the afternoon, I thought about leaving, but the hike back to the car would take time, and I could not shake the feeling that whatever was out there was waiting for me to step out too far. Staying inside felt safer, though it also felt like a trap. That night was the worst. I stayed awake in the dark, gripping my knife, listening. The footsteps came again, but this time they were slower, more deliberate, circling the cabin again and again. Then they stopped near the window. The cabin was silent except for the sound of faint breathing. It was not mine. I was sure of it. I sat frozen, barely able to breathe myself, convinced that if I made a sound, something would happen. The breathing faded, but then I heard the faint sound of the door handle moving. It rattled softly, slowly, as if someone was testing it. My whole body went cold. The chair against the door shook slightly with the movement. After a moment, the handle stopped, and silence fell again. I sat there until the first light of morning showed through the cracks. My body ached from staying so tense. When I stepped outside in daylight, I saw clear footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They were human, barefoot. That sight drained the last of my calm. I knew I could not stay another night. I quickly packed my bag, stuffed the knife into my belt, and decided I would make the hike back to the car. The forest was quiet, but I felt watched the whole time. Every crack of a twig behind me made my skin crawl. The trail back felt endless. My pack dug into my shoulders, and sweat ran down my back, but I did not slow down. I kept checking behind me, convinced I would see someone following, but the path stayed empty. When I finally reached my car, I dropped my bag into the back and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped them. As I started the engine, I looked once more at the trail. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. I drove until the forest was far behind me, not stopping until I reached a main road. Only then did I let myself breathe fully. I never told anyone exactly what happened. I just said the woods made me uncomfortable and left it at that. But I knew what I heard, what I saw. Someone had been out there, circling that cabin for nights, watching me, waiting. If I had stayed one more night, I do not think I would have left at all. I had rented the cabin for a week because I wanted time alone away from everything. Life had been loud, and I wanted something quiet. The cabin sat deep in the woods, almost 2 hours away from the nearest small town. The gravel road that led up to it was rough and narrow, with trees pushing in from both sides, and my old truck rattled the whole way. The place was simple, just one small wooden cabin with a front porch, one main room inside with a fireplace, a small kitchen corner, a bathroom, and a bedroom. There was no phone signal, no internet, and no neighbors for miles. That was what had drawn me to it in the first place. I brought everything I thought I might need. I had food packed for the week, enough bottled water, and basic gear like a flashlight, extra batteries, a lantern, a camping stove, and even a hatchet for firewood. I liked the idea of staying alone and not having to deal with anyone. It felt safe in my head when I planned it. The first day was fine. The woods were quiet except for birds and the wind moving through the trees. The cabin itself had that old wood smell, like it had been standing there for decades. It was clean enough, though it creaked in random places when I walked around. The first night, I slept surprisingly well. The sound of the forest outside was steady, and the bed wasn't too bad. The second day, I went for a long walk through the trees. The ground was uneven, roots sticking out, leaves piled in patches, and small streams cutting through low spots. I carried a backpack with water and snacks, and I marked the trail with bits of orange tape so I wouldn't lose my way. When I got back to the cabin later in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. Near the porch, in the dirt just a few feet away from the steps, I saw footprints. At first, I thought maybe they were mine from when I carried things in from the truck. But they weren't. They were bigger than my boots and deeper, like the person who made them was heavier. They came from the side of the woods and stopped right at the porch, then turned back the way they came. I stood there for a while, staring at them. The ground was soft from rain the day before, so they looked fresh. I told myself it could have been a hunter or a hiker passing through, maybe curious about the cabin, but something about it felt wrong. This place was remote. The owner had told me when I rented it that nobody else came out here. Even hunters stayed away because the land wasn't public. It bothered me enough that I brought the hatchet inside and kept it near the door. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. Every creak of the cabin felt louder. I kept listening to the woods outside, but it was silent, too silent at times, like even the crickets had stopped. I finally dozed off after what felt like hours. The third day was when I really started to feel uneasy. I decided not to go too far from the cabin. I cut some wood, cleaned a bit inside, and read a book I'd brought. Around late afternoon, while sitting on the porch, I noticed something between the trees. At first, I thought it was just a dark patch, but then I realized it was a figure, person. They were standing still about 50 yards back, half hidden by the trees, facing my direction. I froze. My first thought was that maybe I was imagining it, but I knew I wasn't. The shape was too clear. I stared, trying to see if they would move, but after a few seconds, I looked down, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, they were gone. The woods were empty. I sat there for a long time, feeling my chest get tight. The woods stretched in every direction, and I couldn't see far once the trees thickened. I didn't like the idea of someone out there watching me, so I went inside, locked the door, and stayed near the window. For the rest of the evening, I kept glancing outside, but I never saw anyone again. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, like someone walking outside the cabin. Every time I heard something, I grabbed the hatchet and stood by the door, heart racing, waiting. But when I looked through the window, there was nothing. Still, I knew what I'd heard. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. My nerves felt shot, and I started to wonder if I should just pack up and leave early. But I told myself I was overreacting. I tried to stay calm. I cooked food, made coffee, and sat at the table. That was when I noticed something else. On the wooden frame of the window by the table, there were scratches. Thin, shallow lines, not deep, but they hadn't been there before. They looked like someone had run a knife or a sharp tool across the wood. I checked every window and door. On the back window near the bedroom, there were more of those scratches. That made my skin crawl. It meant someone had been right up against the cabin while I slept. I thought about leaving right then, but the truck was parked down the trail, and the idea of stepping outside with someone possibly out there waiting made me hesitate. I kept the hatchet close, and I loaded my backpack with essentials in case I had to leave in a hurry. The hours dragged. By late evening, I sat in the dark with the lantern turned low, not wanting to make it obvious I was inside. My ears kept picking up faint sounds, sometimes far, sometimes closer. At one point, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand hurt. I waited, barely breathing, but whoever it was never knocked or tried the door. After a while, the sound faded. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair, hatchet on my lap, staring at the door until the first light of morning came through the windows. On the 5th day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed everything quickly, keeping watch out the windows. My nerves were raw. Every sound outside made me jump. I carried my bags to the truck in 2 trips, scanning the woods constantly. Nothing moved, but the silence felt heavier than ever. When I went back inside for one last check, I noticed something on the kitchen counter. A single, dirty handprint. It hadn't been there before. The fingers were long, the palm wide, bigger than mine. It made my stomach twist. I didn't waste another second. I slammed the door shut, locked it even though I was leaving, and ran to the truck. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine took a second too long to start, and for that moment I thought something would happen. But it roared to life, and I drove fast down the gravel road, barely caring about the bumps and turns. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a figure stepping out just far enough to watch me go. I didn't slow down. I kept driving until I hit the paved road and finally reached the small town. I stopped at a gas station, shaking so bad I could hardly stand. I stayed there for an hour before I felt steady enough to drive home. I never went back to that cabin, and I never rented anything so isolated again. What stuck with me the most wasn't just the footprints or the scratches or the handprint on the counter. It was the thought of how close they must have been every night while I slept. How they had walked right up to the walls, right up to the windows, maybe watching me through the glass as I lay in bed. And I would never know who it was or why they were there or what they wanted. All I knew was that I had left just in time. I had been planning the trip for weeks before I finally made the drive out to the old cabin. The place was small and tucked deep into the woods, far enough from the nearest town that it felt isolated, but close enough that I could still drive back to a gas station if I needed supplies. I wanted the trip to be quiet, a break from noise, phones, and people. The cabin itself wasn't mine. It belonged to a family friend who didn't visit often anymore. He told me it was rough around the edges, old, and not as comfortable as newer cabins, but it was safe and dry. That was all I needed. I just wanted time alone where I could sit by myself, write in my notebook, and listen to the wind moving through the trees. The road that led out there was narrow, cracked in some places, with brush creeping up close to the edge of the gravel. I had to drive slower than I wanted, weaving around potholes and fallen branches. By the time I reached the small dirt driveway that turned into the woods, I could already feel the quiet pressing in. No houses nearby, no cars passing, just trees, endless rows of them, their trunks lined up and their tops leaning together to block out most of the sky. The cabin sat at the end of the drive, about a quarter-mile in. It was smaller than I expected, weathered wood walls, a tin roof with spots of rust, a little porch with 2 steps leaning to the side as if the ground had shifted beneath them. The windows had old wooden frames, and one of them was patched with cardboard and tape. I parked my car near the side where weeds had grown up around old tire ruts. When I shut off the engine, the silence was heavier than before. Inside, the place smelled of dust and wood smoke. The main room had a couch, a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and a brick fireplace that had black soot marks above it. In the corner was a narrow staircase leading up to a small loft with a single bed. The kitchen was more of a side nook, just a counter, sink, and a propane stove with 2 burners. The water came from a pump out back, and the toilet was an outhouse a short walk away. It wasn't modern living, but that was fine. I had food packed in coolers, matches, and a small supply of firewood stacked inside. The first hours passed quietly. I unpacked, set my things on the table, lit a candle, and walked around to get used to the space. I liked the way the trees made a wall outside the windows, shutting out everything else. I cooked a small meal on the stove and ate in silence. As the sun went down, the woods got darker much faster than they did in town. Shadows pressed right up against the glass. The quiet was so complete that even the sound of me setting down my fork felt loud. That first night was calm. I lay in the loft bed and listened to the fire popping in the stovepipe below. At one point, I heard something outside in the leaves, maybe a deer or raccoon, but it moved away quickly. I wasn't nervous. It was the kind of sound I expected to hear out there. I fell asleep with the window cracked, cool night air drifting in. The next day I spent exploring. I walked along an old trail behind the cabin, following it down toward a small stream. The ground was uneven, with tree roots cutting across the path. I carried a small backpack with water and snacks, but I never went too far. I didn't want to get lost, and I didn't have a map of the area. By the time I returned, I was sweaty and tired. I pumped water from the well, washed my face, and sat on the porch while the sun slid behind the trees again. That night was different. I went to bed the same way, fire low, window cracked, but sometime after midnight I woke up to a sound. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again. A slow crunch of leaves. Not the quick shuffle of an animal, not the scurry of a small creature, but a deliberate step. Then another, then nothing. I held my breath and lay still. The loft was open to the main room, so I could look down at the door. It was shut, latched from inside. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone was moving through the brush just beyond the porch. My first thought was that it could be a hunter or a hiker passing by, but it was after midnight. Nobody would be walking out here at that hour without a reason. I waited, heart pounding, and then the sound stopped completely. I lay there for what felt like an hour, straining to hear. Finally, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remembered was the light of morning pressing through the window. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was half dreaming. Maybe it was just a big animal. But later that day, I walked around the cabin, looking at the ground. In the dirt near the porch, I saw marks. Not clear footprints, but places where the leaves had been pressed down in a pattern that didn't look like deer tracks. It looked like someone had walked there, circling close, then stepping away again. The day was quiet, but my mind kept replaying the sound. When night came, I felt uneasy. I locked the door, checked the windows, and kept the lantern burning longer than usual. I brought my backpack upstairs and kept my flashlight in hand. The woods outside were black again, pressing in against the glass. Sometime after midnight, the sounds returned. First far off, then closer. A slow, steady movement, leaves shifting, a stick snapping, then silence. I sat up in bed, holding my flashlight, every muscle tight. I didn't shine the light out the window because I didn't want to give myself away. I just sat in the dark, listening. The sound lingered for almost half an hour before fading back into the distance. The next morning, I checked again. More disturbed leaves, this time in a clearer line, leading from the tree line toward the cabin and back again. It wasn't just an animal. The steps were too far apart, too even. I thought about leaving. The car was right outside, and town wasn't far, but something in me wanted to prove it was nothing. I told myself maybe it was a neighbor checking their land, maybe kids fooling around, even though I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. That third night was the worst. I kept the lantern burning low and sat in the chair downstairs, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again, but this time it didn't stop at the trees. I heard the porch steps creak. My chest tightened so hard I thought I would pass out. The sound was slow, one step, then another. Whoever it was stood just feet away from the door. I stared at the handle. It never moved, but the air in the room felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sound stayed for minutes, then retreated back into the night. At dawn, I checked again. The dirt in front of the steps was clearly disturbed now. The weeds near the porch had been bent down, like someone had stood there for a while. I didn't sleep the next night. I sat with my flashlight and a kitchen knife in my hand, waiting. The sound came again, same as before. Slow steps around the cabin, circling, pausing, then retreating. By morning, I made up my mind. I packed everything, loaded the car, and locked the cabin. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I kept looking in the mirror. The trees pressed close on both sides. For the first time since arriving, I wanted nothing more than to be back in town with noise, lights, and other people. When I reached the main road, I stopped at the gas station on the edge of town. The clerk asked if I'd been camping. I nodded but didn't explain. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just wanted to get home. That night, back in my own bed, I could still hear it. The slow crunch of leaves, the steps moving closer. Even though I knew I was safe, my mind wouldn't let it go. Someone had been out there. Someone had walked around that cabin at night, over and over, waiting just beyond the door. And the part that stayed with me the most was how they never tried to come inside. They only wanted me to know they were there. The truck had slid off the road so fast I barely had time to understand what was happening. One moment the tires were crunching over frozen gravel, the next the weight shifted, the back end fishtailed, and then the whole thing tilted down into the ditch. The steering wheel locked in my hands, and when the truck finally stopped moving, the front end was buried against a snowbank. The back end twisted sideways. The engine had gone silent. The headlights pointed at the wall of snow like useless eyes. For a few seconds I sat still with both hands tight on the wheel. My heart thumped in my chest, and I could feel it in my neck. Cold air seeped in through the edges of the door. I knew instantly I wasn't going to be able to drive out. The road was a narrow forest road that hadn't been cleared for days. The snow was too deep, and I was too far from the highway. I stepped out into the night. My boots sank almost to the ankle. The only sound was the wind brushing through the tops of the trees. It wasn't a storm, but the cold was heavy, sharp against my face. The sky was pale with the reflection of snow and cloud cover, and I could just make out the shapes of tall pines pressing in on both sides of the road. I knew there was an old cabin somewhere back in these woods. It was on the edge of a frozen lake, about half a mile from where the truck had stopped. I had been there once before, late summer, when the trail was dry and easy to follow. I remembered the angle of the path leading off the road, marked by a leaning birch tree. I climbed the ditch, looked for that tree, and started walking. Each step broke the crust of snow and filled my boots with cold powder. I tried to steady my breathing because every exhale rose in a heavy fog that reminded me how fast my body heat was escaping. The woods closed in tighter the farther I went, and the wind was softer in here, but it was darker. The path wound downhill and then flattened near the lake. I recognized the clearing, the outline of the cabin pressed up against the dark wall of trees. It looked exactly as I remembered, squat, with a slanted roof and one small window on the side. The porch sagged slightly, the wood dark from years of weather. No lights inside, of course, and no sound. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside smelled like old wood, ashes, and dust. The air was colder than outside. My flashlight beam cut across the room, catching on a wood stove in the corner. A table with 2 chairs, a bunk against the wall, and shelves lined with old jars and tins. I shut the door behind me and stood for a while, listening. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint sound of my own blood in my ears. I set my pack down, rubbed my hands together, and got to work. I needed heat. There was a pile of split logs stacked against the far wall. I cleared ash from the stove, set paper and kindling, and lit a match. The flame caught quickly. Soon the crack of burning would fill the silence. I held my hands close until the sting of cold started to fade. The warmth made me feel safe at first, but then I realized I hadn't thought through much beyond that. My truck was stranded, maybe broken. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be driving back after a supply run. I had food in my pack, but not enough for more than a day. If the road stayed blocked with snow, nobody would be coming out here soon. I decided I would stay in the cabin overnight and hike out in daylight. It was too far and too dangerous to try the road back to the highway in the dark. I checked the shelves. Some jars still had beans, rice, even dried fruit. The tins were rusted, but some seemed sealed tight. I opened one and found powdered milk, yellowed but probably still fine. I felt a small bit of relief. Whoever had used this cabin before had left supplies behind. As the night settled in, the temperature dropped. The fire crackled, and I lay down on the bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. The wood popped as it heated. My body finally stopped shivering. My eyelids grew heavy. Just as I started drifting, I heard something. It was faint, a crunch in the snow outside. I froze, listening hard. The fire inside the stove gave off a soft roar, but under it I could hear deliberate steps. Slow, steady. Snow compressed, released. They moved past the cabin, toward the lake. I lay still. My throat felt tight, and every part of me wanted to move, but I didn't. The steps faded after a while. I convinced myself it could have been a deer or a moose, but it hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded measured, spaced out like human feet. I hardly slept. Every little sound pulled me awake. The wind through the chimney, the snap of wood. My imagination started filling the silence with shapes and shadows that weren't really there. By morning, the fire was just glowing coals. I stirred it back to life, added more logs, and ate a handful of trail mix from my pack. My plan was to leave as soon as I had enough light, follow the road back, and see if I could flag down anyone driving by. But when I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, my stomach dropped. There were tracks in the snow. They came from the trees, circled the cabin, stopped right in front of the door, and then led back toward the lake. Large, heavy steps. Boots, not animal prints. Someone had been here during the night. They had walked right up to the cabin while I was inside. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The lake stretched out white and empty, but the prints were fresh, sharp-edged, not softened by wind. I shut the door quickly and dropped the bar across it. My heart pounded. I tried to calm myself by thinking logically. Maybe a hunter had passed through, curious about the cabin. Maybe someone lived nearby. But the way the tracks circled, the way they came right up to the door, it didn't feel casual. It felt like someone had been checking. I sat by the stove, thinking hard. If I left the cabin and tried to hike out, I would be exposed on the open road. If whoever it was came back, they would see me. The cabin felt safer, at least for now. The day dragged by slow. I rationed food, kept the fire low to save wood, and tried to rest. Every few minutes I went to the window and looked out, scanning the snow. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When night came, the fear grew sharper. Every pop of wood made me jump. I kept the fire small so less light leaked through the cracks. At some point in the early hours, I heard it again. Footsteps outside. This time closer, slower. They stopped on the porch. The door creaked, just slightly, as if weight had pressed against it. I held my breath. The wooden bar across the door rattled softly, like fingers testing it. Then silence. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away again. I sat there all night with my eyes wide open, gripping the poker from the stove. My whole body shook, not from cold this time, but from the thought that someone out there wanted to get inside. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever it was, they would come back, maybe in daylight, maybe with more force. I had to try the road, even if it meant being exposed. I packed everything, what little food I had. 2 jars of beans from the shelves, matches, a knife I found in the drawer. I dressed in layers, pulled my hat down, tightened my boots. Before I opened the door, I listened hard. Nothing. Outside, the air was still and biting cold. The prints from the night before were deeper now, pressed into the porch boards. My own prints mixed with them as I stepped off into the snow. I started walking up the trail toward the road, moving fast. My breath came out in thick clouds. Every crunch of my boots felt too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Halfway up the trail, I stopped. There were fresh tracks ahead of me, not mine. They crossed the path, leading from one side of the woods to the other. The edges were clean, made only hours ago. Someone was still nearby. I forced myself forward, heart racing, legs heavy. I reached the road and turned toward where I knew the highway would be miles ahead. The snow was deep, and every step burned my lungs. My ears strained for sounds behind me. After about an hour, I saw it. Smoke, thin and gray, rising through the trees off to the right. Not far, a campfire. My body froze again. Whoever had been around the cabin was still here, camping close to the road. Maybe watching, maybe waiting. I dropped into the ditch and crouched low, forcing myself to breathe quietly. I didn't dare move closer. I didn't dare call out. Instead, I backed slowly away, deeper into the woods on the left side. I moved as quietly as I could, stepping where the snow was thick to muffle sound. I pushed branches aside, heart hammering, until I couldn't see the road anymore. I knew I had two choices: go back to the cabin and barricade myself, or cut through the woods and try to reach the highway without using the road. The cabin felt like a trap now. I decided to keep going through the woods. It would take longer, it would be harder, but at least I wouldn't be walking right into whoever had been circling me all night. Hours passed. My legs grew weak, and my stomach ached with hunger. I stopped only to chew frozen beans straight from the jar, too nervous to make a fire. Every sound in the woods made me whip